Hi, welcome back, everyone. This is your friend Greedy Fanfics, bringing you another fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the third part of What If Deku Had a Super Copy Quirk, written by ᴅᴇᴜᴜ. All credit for this story goes to ᴅᴇᴜᴜ, so please support them by checking out the link in the description for more details. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. The preparations had all been laid out and the plans made for the coming war. And Principal Nizu and the staff of UA intended to use the time between school years to allow them and the other heroes to do the actual physical side of the preparations. Without any students to teach, the teachers were freed up to prep their gear. Power Loader, though, had gone further, allowing his most promising students the opportunity to work over for break as additional workers. Most of the support department had continued chugging along, working with the same frenetic pace as always, but without the distraction of lessons. If anything, this was a valuable learning experience for them by allowing them to work with him and Nizu on improving the school's defenses. They would get experience working with top-of-the-line, state-of-the-art security systems, which would give them additional practical experience. And some of their suggestions had been quite enlightening, with the principal restructuring 3 key points of UA's defenses based on ideas from some freshly graduated students. In exchange for their service, the principal had promised to pull some additional strings to help them find a support company. That deal went for all of the support students who were helping reinforce UA, but it was especially true for those with good ideas he could use. Because of all of this chaos, Nizu rarely had time anymore for something that had become one of his most interesting pastimes: speaking with Twice. The imprisoned lieutenant of the Paranormal Liberation Front was quite talkative and had a unique point of view that he appreciated. They had debated philosophy together quite frequently, which had started from his heavy-handed attempts to convince the man to abandon the League and then blossomed into a thoroughly interesting dynamic. Jean would almost forget that he was in a prison cell for a while, before eventually remembering and becoming more closed off. Oh well, it couldn't really be helped. If the man intended to stay loyal to the Liberation Front, then he would have to stay in his concrete prison until they were no longer an issue. Cementos had been assigned to regularly return there to make sure the cement remained in place, to prevent any escape attempts, and he had confirmed that the man had not managed to remove Miss Hatsum's nullification cuffs. So effectively, barring a major catastrophe and or an attempted rescue, Twice had no chance of escape. Of course, not all of the work was centered around UA. He and the Commission, though privately bitter enemies, were still both servants of the common good, so they were working together to lead the preparations for the war's opening salvos. It was difficult doing so while keeping all of his cards close enough to his chest to not be seen, but hopefully they would be caught off guard when the time was right. Still, despite their feud impeding their cooperation somewhat, UA and the Commission were able to work together quite effectively. Whole towns had been subtly prepared for the outbreak of civil war, from things as minor as shifts in patrol schedules to as major as the creation of fortified shelters for civilians to hide in. Every hero was on an unofficial state of emergency, the only reason for it not being official being a matter of operational security. They couldn't afford the Liberation Front learning of their preparations in the slightest. Unfortunately, that meant that they couldn't keep Hawks within their ranks for too much longer. After all, as both the number 2 hero and a Hero Commission agent, there would be no way that would believe he didn't know about this operation. And as much of a boon as it would be to keep him within their organization long-term, ᴅᴜ had played his part well enough to be able to wrap up this assignment for good. Naturally, Majima had devised a little something that would help make its completion something more devastating to the League and the Liberation Front. The idea had come from a 21st century superhero show, the essential idea being to create a unique and hard-to-remove tracking system for members of the Liberation Front. Each device would contain a mist filled with nanobots that would lock onto living flesh. By planting the devices and wiring them to activate when he hit a detonator, he could effectively track and catalog them in a database. Like a technological equivalent of the search Quirk, but with no restriction to how many individuals could be tracked. Fortunately, the beginnings of that database had already been established, as Hawks had access to records about every PLF member due to his higher status within the organization. And since the Commission had access to the genetic database, they were able to program the nanobots to recognize specific members of the army, allowing them to be tracked in real time. Unfortunately, because of the diverse array of quirks present in the group, and the unknown possibilities of who exactly would be in each base when, they had no way to set up a system to incapacitate them all remotely. Shigaraki, of course, was the major target for this, as hopefully they would be able to incapacitate him, leaving his forces without one of their strongest. Though Power Loader was unsure whether the nanobots would even work, given how decay had evolved in Daika City. What was most imperative now, though, was finding the real Midoriya. His doubles were quite effective for right now, though it was difficult keeping them concealed from the Commission while they were so focused on preparing Japan for war. But at the end of the day, the real power that they needed was the original, genuine, bona fide Izuku Midoriya, successor of All Might and grandson of All for One, Quirk copying Behemoth and future #1 hero, no matter what anyone else says. Nizu sighed, hoping that his protege would show up soon. They were all counting on him. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Dr. Kyudai smiled widely to himself. In about 2 weeks' time, then it would be time for ᴘᴅᴟ to awaken at last. And on the anniversary of his first real outing, too. The USJ attack had been a premonition of things to come, he now realized. What with Midoriya's presence there alongside All Might, as well as Shigaraki's first brush with the so-called heroes. It had all led to Kamino, and that had led them here, with the white-haired boy lying still on the operating table. He had finished healing up all of ᴘᴅᴟ's superficial injuries and scars, leaving his skin just like the rest of his body, effectively newborn. For the child had died a violent death in Daika City, as the true monster before him had replaced the former Tenko Shimura. It was only fitting after that spiritual rebirth that he goes through a physical one as well. Gone was the mortal man, and now only the demon remained, with nothing left to confine him. Of course, they would need to distract the heroes while he moved ᴘᴅᴟ elsewhere. And to that end, he had arranged something with the Liberation Front, something he called the Day of Liberation. When the signal came, the members of the front would rise up and start attacking major population centers and heroic strongholds across Japan. Destro would be sent to tear down the headquarters of the Safety Commission, while several squads would be scrambled to take on UA. Of course, they were unlikely to penetrate the defenses, given that they had been reinforced after All for One's incarceration. But at the very least, it would distract the bearer of One for All from trying anything that would interfere with ᴘᴅᴟ's transit. Once they reached the villa, then he would undo the near comatose state that young Shigaraki was currently in, and they would begin to make their plans for the future. Of course, the most important part of that would be to catch him up on what he had missed during the long spell that he had been under the knife for. Twice's disappearance, as well as that of his original self, were most worrying. It was extremely likely that the two of them were somewhere in Tartarus, and yet All for One's resources were not extensive enough to confirm that. What they were good for, of course, was arranging for like-minded criminals and revolutionaries to start similar uprisings across the globe. That would hopefully forestall any foreign aid, as had happened with Humorai's almost total obliteration. And another thing that he had discovered with his resources was the exact process for creating ᴜᴜ-ᴜ, which involved a very familiar quirk. He had met Ken Sano as a child, using his Tsubasa alias as a way to steal his quirk, forced quirk activation. And given that the man's daughter's quirk was used as the primary source of the compounds that forcibly activated the target's quirk, he knew he could make it. After all, he had made copies of forced quirk activation and put it onto one of his Nomu. He could derive the compounds from that, and by mixing them with regular trigger, that would allow him to create powerful bombs capable of eliminating large amounts of people. Unfortunately, even the vast network of spies and informants that All for One and the Liberation Front together could wield was unable to get any information of Izuku Midoriya's birth quirk. It was extremely vexing, because given the way that the All Might look-alike European crime boss had been thoroughly curb-stomped by Class 1A along with the rest of his underlings, it must be strong, especially in combination with One for All. He knew that the boy had manifested the quirks of past users, though he only had confirmation of Black Whip and Float for now. What was more, he had lost all record of Yuga Aoyama's cell number, as well as all record of his family in general. All he had was his own memory to rely on, and given how old he was, that wasn't saying much. At 120 years of age, his mind had definitely begun to slow down. And though life force was somewhat able to slow down that decline, it wasn't perfect. Where physically he was 60 and chronologically 120, mentally he was about 75 years old, with senility and dementia beginning to set in. He had asked once if All for One could give away a copy of the singular sanity quirk that he had stolen. Even now, he still had that copy preserved somewhere. He would have to wait for ᴘᴅᴟ to wake up unfortunately, given that the only one who could surgically implant quirks was himself, and he couldn't play both roles. But what was more important was making sure to develop some basic plans to combat all of the things that had cropped up since the symbol of fear had went to sleep. The Aoyamas needed to be brought to heel and put back in line, while Twice and his original self needed to be rescued from wherever they were being held, along with rescuing the master himself from Tartarus. All in all, a very tall order for them to pull off, but one that could be accomplished in the end. Soon, Japan would once more know fear, and the peace that All Might had brought would breathe its last. For soon, their destroyer would awaken, and every one of the tiny, insignificant people who walked this earth would be crushed by his and All for One's ultimate creation, their monster. And he would be rewarded for his faithful service as well, he was sure, being granted a life of luxury as a servant of this world's true master. He grinned cruelly, imagining the twisted delights that were to come and licking his lips in anticipation. His precious Noma would finally receive the glory they were due, like all of his work. As the sun rose over the eastern sea, 2 signals were transmitted across Japan. One, sent by Dr. Kyudai, acting Grand Commander of the Paranormal Liberation Front, had informed the group's membership that today was the day of liberation. He made sure to tell them that he would be sending them another signal that same day when the Grand Commander awoke once more, to tell them to begin the day's celebratory fireworks. Everyone would carry out their assignments to the letter, and by day's end, they would be in the prime position to truly liberate Japan. The second signal was sent by the current and former number 1 heroes, warning every one of their fellow heroes to be on their guard. Endeavor himself would be leading the assault on the hospital, with the intent of capturing Shigaraki before he could be awakened and spirited away. UA was of course on high alert, with some of the top 10 heroes deployed to aid in their defense. Hawks, meanwhile, would be joining the doctor behind closed doors and submitting his resignation in a more final way, finally ending his undercover assignment by helping Endeavor capture All for One's successor before he could wreak havoc. As the precise 1-year anniversary of the USJ attack came, Endeavor's team strode through the doors of Jakku General Hospital unannounced, headed directly for the morgue. Fortunately, thanks to Hawks, they knew the full floor plan, including exactly how many Noma were on site. Individual heroes split off from the main group, beginning an emergency evacuation of the civilians as planned to prevent the Noma from causing any additional casualties. Within less than 5 minutes, all of the staff and the civilians had been evacuated from the hospital, while the heroes stood in front of the secret entrance into the catacombs where the Mad Doctor's true work was done. The Noma did not stir as they passed, which at first surprised them. But soon, they saw why they had not been immediately awoken. The Doctor was on his hands and knees, cowering before the form of the winged hero, who was leveling a pistol to his head. "You're just a double, so there's no need to really worry about you except for the fact that you could wake the Noma. And we can't have that," he said cheerfully, his eyes cold as he stared into the eyes of the monster that had been All for One's right-hand man for decades. "For the sake of Japan. Plus ultra," he cried, as he pulled the trigger and fired. As soon as he did, several things happened in quick succession. Once the bullet finished passing through the duplicate of the already physically infirm mad scientist, he began breaking down, turning into the brown sludge that was characteristic of Twice doubles. Within moments, he was little more than a puddle on the floor. But that was only the first thing that happened in the precious few seconds after he pulled the trigger. At the sound of a gunshot, every dormant monster and beast within the chamber sprung to life. The eyes of every Noma shot wide open, their containment tubes shattering as their programming detected hostile intruders. Immediately, the heroes were surrounded by the bioengineered horrors, trying desperately to stay alive as the monsters used their full might against them. Hawks soon noticed something even more terrifying, as the insignia of the Paranormal Liberation Front appeared on the computer screen, flashing with firework symbols surrounding it. That could only mean one thing, and he looked toward the slab where Shigaraki lay to confirm it. Tomura Shigaraki was awake, having bolted upright at the sound of a gun. He looked at Hawks with incandescent fury, seeing the gun in the pile of familiar sludge and coming to one singular conclusion. With a roar of rage, he lunged toward the winged hero, Decay springing to life at his command. As the signal of the Grand Commander's awakening was received, PLF operatives across the country began their assigned tasks. Communications agents sent the word to their allies overseas, telling them that the time had come to rise up, before setting to work jamming the heroes' comm frequencies. Destro himself quickly left Gunga Villa, intent on fulfilling his assigned mission of destroying the Hero Commission's headquarters, especially since it would give him revenge for their takedown of his beloved Detonrat. What none of them knew quite yet was that Hawks had made sure to tune the activation frequency of the devices that Power Loader had given him to the same frequency that heralded Shigaraki's awakening. The swarms of nanobots loaded in them silently exited, latching onto their programmed targets and recording their location. No one noticed a thing, nor would they until it was too late. After all, at this point, only Shigaraki himself, and Twice, knew that Hawks was a traitor in their ranks. Speaking of Twice, the sudden onslaught caught the duplicating villain's attention. He knew that something major was happening, but he had no idea as to what. Though soon enough, he had his answer. Cementos was too busy defending the outside of UA to remember Babigawara, and eventually some of the members of Toga's division managed to find his cell. Within about 5 minutes, Twice was freed from his captivity and was hurriedly spilling the beans to his lead comrade. For her part, Himiko immediately contacted Central Command, passing along her new intel to the rest of the front. "It's only 10:30 in the goddamn morning, and already so much has happened today," thought Principal Nizu as he directed the efforts of the UA defenders. Shigaraki had awoken, Twice had been rescued, Hawks had exposed himself, and the Hero Commission's headquarters had been turned into smithereens. The war now no longer looked to be as certain in their favor, as with the enemy back near the pinnacle of their full strength, they needed to find a clever way to set up their endgame. After all, for them to truly defeat All for One, Tamura Shigaraki and the Paranormal Liberation Front, they would need to play the trump card that was Izuku Midoriya in just the right way and at just the right moment. Tamura Shigaraki sat comfortably upon a gilded chair as he contemplated all that Skeptic had passed onto him. So much had happened during his metamorphosis, and the game had most certainly moved closer towards its final stages. But whose endgame was closest to fruition was hard to discern. Was the Paranormal Liberation Front as far ahead as he had hoped, or did the damnable heroes have an advantage he was not aware of? But of course, the most important thing that had happened during his metamorphosis was the mental changes that had happened to him. Tamura and All for One had almost fully melded, with minimal delineation left between the two. The only real subject of concern regarding his psyche was the shadow of young Tenko Shimura, who was struggling to retain independence, even trying to incite the vestiges of his stolen quirks to rebel against him. But his younger self was not truly a threat, not in the way that other pieces on the board were. Master, or All for One as he called himself, still remained within him, trying to take control over their merger. Tamura's hatred was keeping him at bay for now, and as soon as Tenko had been fully subsumed into him, he would be strong enough to force the last remaining holdout into submission. Once the symbol of evil's vestige was subsumed, it would be trivial for him to break into Tartarus and take on the demon's mantle, stealing every single quirk he had and leaving him as a useless empty husk moments away from death. He was merciful enough to give the man who had raised him a peaceful death, even if that man had tried to possess him through their shared quirk. And then he would move to do what his predecessor never could and finally take one for all for himself, followed soon thereafter by New Order. With the world's most powerful quirks under his dominion, he would be able to rule this world as its lord and master. Though he would not be so cringe as to call himself the Demon Lord. For as much as All for One had rubbed off on him, that was one of several things that he did not share with his former master. His phone started ringing, and he knew instantly that it was Toga. After Daika City and a compressed suggestion, he had created personalized ringtones for each member of the League, as well as the other major leaders of the Liberation Front, in order to save time in an emergency. Shigaraki picked up the phone, putting it to his ear and holding it with his pinky out. Decay had evolved to the point that he could control when it activated, but he still held things in a similar way because he was unused to its awakened form. "Toga, what have you got for me this time?" he asked pleasantly. "Oh my god, Tamura, we found someone who's been missing for weeks. We found Jean in prison on the outskirts of UA." As he spoke to her, he thought about how much had truly been happening. She had passed on Twice confirmation that Hawks had betrayed him, and that meant he now had to rethink absolutely everything that he had been a part of. Their plans would need to be changed, and their bases of operations moved if they were to win this war. After all, the winged hero had wormed his way into the highest echelons of the front, gaining access to all of their most secretive information. Hell, it explained how the heroes had managed to anticipate the day of liberation. Now, almost everything going forward hinged upon the planned mass breakout from Tartarus. From recovering the Doctor and taking all of the Master's accumulated quirks to rescuing Kurogyri and growing his forces, the prison named after the Greek underworld held captive every resource he needed if he was going to 100% complete the game with all the trophies. ᴅᴇʟᴜ was so stoked to finally be back with his friends that he actually ran up to Shigaraki and full-on bear-hugged him. Then he had broken down into tears, apologizing for letting himself be tricked again, just like with Overhaul. Surprisingly, Tamura forgave him, telling him that it wasn't his fault that he had a big heart, only asking him to be more careful next time. Then his friend's face had turned serious, as he gave him an important task using double to make copies of some of the high-end Nomu. After all, some of their best had been irreparably destroyed in the fight at the hospital, and they didn't have the medical or surgical expertise needed to repair them, let alone make new ones. For the moment, they couldn't afford to send the actual Nomu themselves, instead making do with doubles. Twice had been enthusiastic, promising to make his friends proud. Tamura's slight smile and Toga's fang grin reassured him that he was still loved, even if he had failed them and brought an enemy into their midst yet again. Once he had given twice his task, Tamura turned to his party's resident shapeshifter. "Toga, I want to order you to infiltrate UA, but knowing what we do about the hero's capabilities, and especially what we know about Nizu, I don't think it's wise to send the real you. Fortunately, since Jean is here, we don't really have to worry about that. What I need from you is to get your hands on a sample of Izuku Midoriya's blood." Himiko's eyes widened. She may not have been told the truth about One for All, but she was aware of just how damn powerful Midoriya was. And she was also capable of reading through the lines. He didn't just want her to impersonate him, he wanted her to capture him so that Tamura could take his strong quirk for himself. She smiled widely, before stating, "So long as I get to keep him." Barely holding down his revulsion as her Yandere tendencies manifested yet again, he smiled at her and nodded in agreement, silently allowing her to keep the boy once he was quirkless. Fortunately for the heroes, they had planned several steps ahead. Thanks to Majima's devices, they not only had location tracking for all Liberation Front members, but they also had access to a live audio feed around each of them. They had trackers on Himiko Toga, so they were privy to her conversation with Shigaraki and twice. What was more, these nanobots were cleverly designed to be able to spread to others through touch. So, they were now able to track ᴅᴇʟᴜ and the Grand Commander, as well as any associates who may or may not join the front in the future. Of course, if Shigaraki used decay, it was extremely likely that the nanobots would be destroyed. Fortunately, some of the nanobots were programmed to be able to painlessly embed themselves into living skin, effectively integrating themselves into their host and protecting them from the effects of decay. And while they were not shielded from the effects of radio waves, they did not emit any radio waves, so he would be unlikely to notice them. The first priority, of course, was to up the defenses of UA. Everyone knew Midoriya was a powerhouse, even if no one outside of UA knew exactly what his quirk was. The thought of Himiko Toga potentially gaining access to that kind of power was terrifying, and it would also potentially open up an opportunity for her to kidnap him and bring him to Shigaraki on a silver platter. They all knew that that was a nightmare scenario, but only those who were aware of One for All and Mimicry knew just how devastating it would be. He would be even more like a god than he already was, as with One for All empowering his quirks and the exploit with Mimicry that allowed the user to duplicate quirks, he would be unstoppable, only growing stronger with time. Second was to secure Tartarus, as the possibility of All for One and the hundreds of dangerous convicts locked up there running loose across Japan was completely unacceptable. They could not afford to let that happen, because it would almost certainly erode their carefully cultivated advantage, and they were not yet close enough to the endgame to play the winning hand. Not to mention that they had yet to even find the key component of that winning hand, Midoriya Prime, the real, bona fide, original Izuku Midoriya. True, they had 4 clones of him, 3 of which were on regular patrols as anonymous heroes while the 4th split his time between school and patrolling publicly as the can-do hero, Deku. But those 4 were needed to keep up the pretense that the real deal was still there and keep the commission off of Midoriya's back. And they unfortunately lacked most of the quirks that they were relying on to win the war, wielding only One for All, Erasure and the previous wielder's quirks. Unfortunately, they had something else to deal with, as before being shot by Hawks, the Doctor's double had managed to synthesize several gallons worth of idiot trigger, which the Liberation Front was using to great effect on some of the lesser-known heroes and even on civilians, forcing them to be unwilling accomplices in their destructive rampages. Sun Eater, Real Steel and Rocklock had all been attacked with it, though the effects were minimal because of the nature of their quirks. Others were far less fortunate. At least once every hour, yet another fire quirk user was dosed, starting a blaze that took valuable time to extinguish. In the 3 days since the beginning of what was being called the Paranormal Liberation War, there had been untold chaos across the world thanks to the former Meta Liberation Army, with Japan as one of the worst afflicted countries thanks to the immense power that came from the merged resources of All for One's League of Villains and Destro's followers' connections throughout their home country. Heteromorphs the world over had begun pledging allegiance to Shigaraki, joining the army to fight for a world where they would be treated decently, as did a sizable portion of those in poverty, many of whom had socially taboo meta abilities. All Might had all but taken over present Mix radio show by now, the two heroes using their charisma to try and convince people not to buy into Shigaraki's rhetoric, promising that he wasn't as genuine as he seemed. To try and help them out, heteromorphic students from classes 2A, 2B, 3A and 3B spoke about their experiences and their intention to make things better for those who look or live differently. Invisible Girl, Pinky and Earphone Jack, despite being human-shaped, talked about the kinds of things that they went through because of their appearances. Uravity talked very frankly about her parents' financial situation, sharing her hope of helping them retire by becoming a hero, while praising the new equal law for helping her parents cut costs by letting their employees use their quirks for construction. And though their messages definitely got through to a lot of people, there was still a sizable amount of people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by joining Shigaraki's cause. Unknown to all but those of the highest security clearance within the Hero Public Safety Commission, there was a plan in place to deal with those who were more unwilling to leave the Paranormal Liberation Front. After all, once Star and Stripe had taken out Hummer Eyes, they had made sure to confiscate their stock of 괜ᴜtrigger. And with Power Loader having ingeniously placed trackers on every member of the Liberation Front, they now knew where every single base was. If these upstarts wanted to use their quirks so badly, then perhaps their government representatives should oblige them. Oh sure, it would cause untold devastation as their quirks ran out of control, perhaps killing thousands of civilians. But the leadership of the commission believed that such casualties, unfortunately, were necessary to stamp the Liberation Front out and wipe it off the face of the earth. And it was one of the options that did not point noticeably to their involvement, compared to a simple nuclear strike. The president had briefly inquired about the possibility of an orbital strike, but apparently weapons systems were illegal to put into space according to the Outer Space Treaty of 1963. True, that treaty had been violated shortly before the dawn of quirks, but the political fallout had been severe. The North Korean regime had not survived that controversy for more than a year. Unfortunately, more and more, it seemed that the only real way to deal with the League of Villains, led by All for One and Tamura Shigaraki, was to use orbital kinetic bombardment. The idea had been canned by the American military centuries ago, but perhaps it was time to revive it. Tartarus Maximum Security Villainous Prison, off the eastern coast of Japan. The guards of Tartarus were shuddering, prepared to defend against the inevitable wave of Liberation Front forces that were certainly coming to break out the prisoners, particularly All for One and the more despicable villains that had been locked up over the past few years. This was something that they could not let come to pass, if they could help it. Even if the commission hadn't given them orders to protect this prison with their very lives, they still would have done so. After all, the Paranormal Liberation War was raging, meaning that not a single hero could be spared to back them up. And even despite the odds of their survival being grim, every one of those brave men and women knew that the escape of any prisoners, especially the high-risk ones, was another villain that would fight alongside Shigaraki and add to the devastation Japan suffered. They had been forewarned of this attack by two separate parties, the commission president herself and Principal Nizu. The president had shared intel derived from someone with a future sight quirk, indicating that Tamura Shigaraki would be coming here personally to bust out as many as he could to swell his numbers. Nizu had said much the same, though he provided an additional detail based on his observations. Since Dr. Garaki was currently incarcerated and his double had been taken out by Hawks at the hospital, the PLF had no way to heal or create Nomu. And given that the Doctor and All for One himself were locked up here, it made sense that he would use doubles of the existing Nomu to minimize losses. Radar suddenly picked up a horde of moving objects, around the size of fighter jets. And within seconds, they had visual contact, confirming that Tamura Shigaraki and a fleet of Nomu doubles were speeding toward them like a horde of demons. The warden cursed, before switching on the radio and contacting the mainland. Then, as he'd been authorized by the commission, he ordered the guards to shoot to kill, regardless of whether they were Shigaraki, a Nomu or a prisoner trying to escape. He even gave full authorization for quirk use by the guards, knowing the guns would not last forever. Even still, it was difficult. As Nomu started to reach the perimeter of the fortress, the deafening spray of gunfire erupted. Several of the Nomo, far less durable because of their nature as duplicates, quickly melted away from the severe damage inflicted in such a short time. But as Shigaraki himself drew nearer, there were less and less of the lower-grade Nomo that had been the first wave of the assault. Now they were having difficulties, as they were faced with high-end Nomo. Quirk use became more prominent, some even abandoning their guns to focus solely on their quirks. And it did help, to some degree. The doubles had a lower limit for damage, making them only as strong as a lower-tier Nomo. And those had been dealt with quite easily at Kamino by squads of police officers, backed up by Endeavor. Unfortunately, they couldn't kill the Nomo fast enough. Soon, the symbol of fear was on top of them, and with a sadistic grin, he fired off several blasts of wind with air cannon. His precision was unnatural and the force of the blasts so potent that he was able to completely destroy large amounts of the guards' bodies. One had a massive hole drilled through his chest, turning his heart into a pool of blood. Another's head was thrown so violently into the air it may just as well have entered orbit, his neck spurting out blood. A third fell to the ground, paralyzed as her spine was severed. And from the looks of things, she wasn't going to make it. The other guards rallied seeing their fellows destroyed with such casual nonchalance. One of them was a loving husband and father, with a baby girl on the way that would never know her daddy. Another was a beloved grandfather, only weeks away from retirement. And the last of the three had been a new transfer, only out of the police academy for about a year, and in high school before that. None of them deserved to die, and yet Tamura Shigaraki levitated there in midair, chuckling to himself. Suddenly, he spoke to himself, not even acknowledging the heinous deeds he had just committed. Haven't tried this trick before. Let's see if it'll work. He materialized a rock in his hand, closing his fist around it and touching it with all 5 fingers. Then, before anyone could stop him, he threw it with force only his enhanced body could manage. It impacted the wall of the prison, before disintegrating in no. "Everybody out," cried their commander, but it was too late. Decay was too powerful and too swift now to be outrun by anyone not possessing a speed quirk. Within moments, every last one of them was reduced to little more than a pile of dust. But even then, the spread was not done. After all, this little experiment with decay was to see the full limits of what it could do. He had already proven that he could spread it through projectiles, proving his theory correct. But its work was not done, as he had yet to liberate the prisoners within. As he watched, the wave of obliteration spread throughout the prison. Whole areas of the structure developed cracks before falling to the ground, turning to dust before they impacted. Hundreds of personnel were wiped from the face of the earth in moments, most not registering the threat until it was too late. Soon enough, only the 4 walls surrounding the outside of the prison stood, along with the inmates of Tartarus. Sensei had wanted them to use radio waves to knock out the systems, but this experiment proved that decay was still more than worthwhile. Noticing him standing there on the wall, the prisoners moved towards him. Those who were more recently checked into this fine establishment recognized him immediately, while those who were less up-to-date stared in apprehension, sizing him up. Tamura noticed Chisaki Kai, still powerless without his hands, and suppressed the urge to laugh at least out loud. After all, his focus now was on recruitment. That meant he needed his game face on. "You are free now. Wreak havoc across Japan as you will. I have only one request," he said, a quirk helping his voice carry and inspiring the same charisma and dread that Sensei always had. "If you believe that those that have strong quirks should be allowed to use them as they please, then follow me. We can fight to make sure that everyone can use quirks as they please, so that we can change the rules in the world. So that we can do as we wish." Many of them flocked to him, offering oaths of allegiance to his cause. Others simply said they'd rather run free than take orders, and he allowed them to run free. Chaos, after all, would stretch the hero's forces thin and run them ragged for the Paranormal Liberation Front. He was roused from his musings by the feeling of a familiar presence making its way towards him. And looking askance, he was unsurprised to see All for One making his way towards his, levitating the life-prolonging machinery attached to him so that he could walk. "Well done, Tamura. Even if I had planned for things to go differently, you certainly achieved the desired results. Now, if we could talk in private?" "Yes, Sensei. I've been meaning to talk to you. About what is rightfully mine," he growled. All for One's smile faltered momentarily, before it widened again. Of course, Tamura. I know that you want to keep being in control. And of course, I want to take your body as my new vessel. How about a compromise of sorts? We fight to take control of this world together, and once that is done, we battle to determine who gets control over your body. Tamura pondered this idea for a second, before finding the terms to be amenable. Fine, but if we're going to be working together as equals, I'm going to need to know a lot of things, including your given name. You've been holding a lot back from me, and I'm not just your apprentice anymore. The symbol of evil nodded in acknowledgement, before observing, the good doctor does not appear to be here. Neither is Kurojirai, and we haven't seen him in months, Tamura mentioned, concernedly. I had also hoped to recruit the services of Lady Nagan after your rescue. But she is noticeably absent. A possibility surfaced in Tamura's mind, as he recalled what had happened to Twice. It's possible that they could be holding them beneath ᴅᴜ. All for One nodded, with his successor continuing, that will be one of our major targets then. ᴅᴜ High, staff room. The heroes were panicking now, as with the jailbreakers roaming free throughout Japan, and in many cases fighting alongside the Paranormal Liberation Front, their forces were stretched to the limit. Several heroes had already quit since the beginning of the war, and it seemed very likely that more would in the coming days. With so many behind the two symbols of malevolence, it would be extremely difficult for them to restore order. Fortunately, they still did not have the capabilities of Dr. Garaki in creating and repairing Nomu, though with All for One's expertise it was likely he could try and turn others into newer Nomu. All four of the Midoriya clones were having panic attacks, as while the two symbols had not specifically mentioned One for All, they had implicitly referenced it. After all, Kurojirai and the doctor, while valuable to their plans, were not exactly so crucial to risk an attack on ᴅᴜ. This made it obvious that they were seeking him out, trying to find him and take One for All. Even the four of them wouldn't be able to truly contend with both of them, with access to only the quirks of One for All, as well as erasure. At the very least, the existence of One for All wasn't revealed, as that would inevitably draw too much attention from the Commission for his and Nisa's plans. Aoyama was panicking just as much, because the only other who was aware of his role as traitor was now freed, ready to call on him to betray his class again. But with the reassurances of his friends in Class 2A, he was ready to start formulating a plan. All for One wasn't aware that he had switched sides, and his lie detector quirk had a certain key flaw. Midoriya and Shinso had once tested whether brainwashing could fool polygraph, and it had done so with flying colors. The villain had obtained his own lie detector from a Tsukachi ancestor, so it likely had similar mechanics. And they could use that to manipulate him into a situation. Search could also be misled, as Monoma and Aways had access to some of Shirakumo-senpai's hair, which would allow them to use Warp Cloud despite Midoriya's disappearance. It was entirely possible that they could trick Shigaraki and his allies into a trap of their own devising, taking full advantage. Izuku Midoriya felt a pulse of energy from Yoichi flitting across his consciousness. Clearly, it would soon be time, if he felt something from his brother. Well, he would need to be there for the final battle. After all, as the next symbol, it was his duty to end the threat and restore peace to the world. It would make his determination to stay alive for as long as he had rather fruitless if he didn't show up. Soon, the circle of time would be closed, and he would be ready to once more take his place in the glorious golden sunlight. He rolled aside the rock that concealed his resting place and opened a warp gate, stepping through to parts unknown in order to further his plans. All for One and Tamura Shigaraki levitated calmly, with young Aoyama standing in front of them, teary-eyed. Tamura took great delight in the betrayed expression on Midoriya's face. It was delicious, almost as much as the secret Dabi had shared with him right before he and Sensei left to meet up with their mole. He couldn't wait to take One for All and finally rule over this earth as was his right, making it into a playground for the League. The boy suddenly turning and firing a naval laser right at his head was unexpected, but he easily deflected the energy with Reflect. Such pointless defiance, child, All for One crooned darkly. Even if your parents were safe, you would have no way of standing against the two of us, even together with the ninth user. Surprisingly, Midoriya grinned widely, replying easily, "You're wrong on both counts, old man. We relocated Yuga's parents a while ago, right about the time that we came back from Nabu Island. As for being able to take you on, I'm pretty sure that we have that covered." What the fuck was this shit? How the fuck did this snotty-nosed little all-might wannabe hero brat not only outplan them but have the courage to insult him to his face? It was irritating, just as much as father had been. ᴘᴅᴟ could feel decay activating, pulsing with the intention of finally removing this thorn in his side. As soon as he lost his quirk, then he would no longer be needed. The familiar acrid scent of warping filled his nose, as the members of the league appeared with the elites of their respective divisions, ready to do the will of their grand commander. He smiled toothily, imagining the screams of pain that Midoriya would make as his bones were turned into splintered fragments. Suddenly though, that sense of sadistic anticipation faded into confusion, as a portal, similar to one of Kuroji's own but sky-blue colored, appeared. And then his confusion morphed into dread as heroes poured out of the portal without hesitation. He could see that the entirety of the top 20 was here, alongside the rest of Class 2A, who had been his victims just barely over a year ago now. And in an instant, large metal barricades sprung out of the ground, trapping them. Shigaraki smiled. Clearly these fools were desperate, if they thought that anything solid could contain him. They had been fighting against him for a year, and yet they had still forgotten about the first and most powerful ability he had, decay. He could easily destroy this structure. Of course, he was wrong. The heroes were fully aware of decay's power, but the success of Operation Troy did not hinge on whether or not it would be destroyed. Instead, the operation depended on exactly when it happened. With the element of surprise, it would take several moments before any of the villains recovered enough to bust free of their confines, at which point they would have been pushed through a warp gate to their prearranged destination, with a carefully chosen lineup of heroes designed to counter each and every member of the League. To use chess terminology, Shigaraki and All for One were akin to queens, the most powerful pieces on the board. Naturally, to prevent them from gathering strength, they needed to separate them and then send in their best to take care of them. Shigaraki was being handled by Mirko, Genist, Lemillion, Nijirchan, Sun Eater, Dynamite, and one of the Midoriya clones. All for One was similarly occupied with Endeavor, Hawks, ᴅᴘᴛᴏ, and Tsukuyomi. Monoma had briefly contemplated the possibility of using Warp Cloud to join them, but had settled for being the puppeteer opening new portals as needed. His focus would be on transporting the defeated villains into a temporary holding zone with Warp Gate. There had been a brief discussion of whether all of the Midoriya clones would be allowed to fight in the battle, but given that it would cause confusion and potentially tip their hand a bit too early, it had been decided that they still needed to keep only one Midoriya out and about. To prevent any of them accidentally being seen, the 4 clones had actually merged together into one, with the combined memories and experiences of all of them, though they possessed no additional quirks. So the Izuku Midoriya out there was the only known version of him, save for the original, who was currently God knows where. If Shigaraki was like a queen, then Spinner would be like a rook, a powerful leader who had helped inflame old hurts and rally the disenfranchised to Shigaraki's cause. And behind him were hundreds of heteromorphs fighting for change, fighting for what they perceived as the best path to better treatment. Naturally, Tentacle, Anima, Present Mike, Rock Lock and Loud Cloud took charge of fighting them. So far as they knew, Spinner would try and free Kuroji'ri, but since he had been restored to his true self, it was fruitless. Besides, Shirakumo could easily and non-lethally take care of the army of angry heteromorphs. To continue the analogy, Toga was like a bishop, a skilled infiltrator who thoroughly believed in her own way of doing things, counter to how the world worked. With the skilled warriors and assassins under her command, she would have been equally effective in most situations, but her best outcome would naturally come about with stealth and deception. Given the fact that the League had been ambushed, she naturally did not have such advantages in fighting against Gang Orca, Selkie, Uravity, Froppy, and Sirius. She did not have the blood of anyone that was particularly powerful so far as they knew, and her subordinates were not used to coastal combat like the heroes were. The fourth important League member to pay attention was Todoroki Tuya, alias Dabi. His best analog was to a knight, as he was aggressive but calculated. He had worked his hardest to ensure that the moment of his reveal to the public would hit with maximum impact, turning the public against heroes. And while Nizu and Midoriya had put plans in place to counteract that reveal, they were not so foolish as to let Tuya run free. No, instead, they sent Ida, Pyrofrost and the Flaming Sidekickers there to deal with him, stopping this cycle of family drama once and for all. But there was yet a 5th member of the League that was crucial for the heroes to protect. Members of classes 2A and 2B, including Pinky, Red Riot, Mindjack, Grape Juice, Mudman, Rule and Spectre ventured to the ruins of Jaku City along with MT Lady and Midnight to protect the slumbering ᴘᴇʟ, preventing him from being awakened and used by the Paranormal Liberation Front. Midnight and Mild Lady would be the main heavyweights, as between the sedative mist that the R-rated hero produced and the immense size of the titanous heroine, they would be able to subdue him and keep him asleep. And if the Liberation Front and their allies came to try and rescue him, then the two experienced pros would be able to keep the second years out of trouble. All Might stood up straight as he watched the separate groups move through the portal, saluting them and internally wishing them luck. He wished it wasn't needed, but honestly, it was. After all, no matter how talented the second years were, these were real villains, the kind of people who would slit their mother's throat for a payout, rape women or eat children. Yeah, those kinds of villains. He looked down towards young Aoyama, who was hugging Fat Gum hard. After a moment, he decided that he had better get his ass out there. Heroics 101, if there's a crying child, you comfort them. And Yuga Aoyama was one of his students, one who had suffered so badly at the hands of his worst enemy. He needed to do this. As the senior hero leading this strike team, Hisashi Yamada, better known as the voice hero present Mike, had a lot of responsibility. After all, 3 of the people fighting alongside him against Spinner and the heteromorph mob were UA students, and one of them was an old friend of his, long thought dead until halfway through the previous school year. And despite the members of Class 2A having proven themselves as more than capable, he was still somewhat leery about letting students fight in an active war setting. Still, he had to admit that the 2 of them were damn capable heroes. Spinner had not been summoned by All for One like the rest of the league had been, instead having been ordered to attempt to free ᴘᴅ-ᴟᴟ from the hospital. Since Shirakumo had been restored to his true self for quite some time now, their actual concern was with how the reptilian villain would react. It was entirely possible that he might start sowing indiscriminate terror and going on a rampage, and that was why they had to be there to head him off. Besides, Shuichi Iguchi was one of their most dangerous threats outside of the villain's symbols and the high-end Nomu, since he was one of the very few that had been given additional quirks, and that was without mentioning the very large mob of disgruntled heteromorphs that followed him. For all of these reasons, the 5 of them had been sent alone. Normally, for a crowd of several thousand disaffected rioters, this kind of mission would take dozens of heroes, but they had Loud Cloud, and his warp clouds would allow them to take them into custody with trivial ease. Meanwhile, Tentacle, Anima, Present Mike and Rocklock would take responsibility for taking on Spinner specifically. The plan started off easily enough, as Shirakumo had created a large amount of teleportation-capable mist, and stored it in the sewer systems, allowing him to catch them off guard by letting it flood out of a pre-arranged open manhole. Within moments, the sky-blue clouds had spread through the crowd, as their controller sat on another one of his own clouds, directing their movement from above. Every second, several dozen rioters were engulfed by the clouds, disappearing from the battlefield in an instant, arriving in secured cells prepared by skilled engineers, including recent graduates from UA's support course. By the time they realized what was going on and thought to flee, half of the mob had been captured. In under 5 minutes, the entirety of the street was clear of rioters, leaving only their leader, who was snarling and breathing heavily. ᴘᴅ-ᴟᴟ, he boomed as he hefted his ridiculously sized compound sword. Must rescue ᴘᴅ-ᴟᴟ. News flash, pal. ᴘᴅ-ᴟᴟ hasn't existed for about half a year at least. Now he's back to being what he was before than a UA hero student. In fact, the same hero student who just wiped out your goons, Present Mike revealed, with an ugly grin. Lies, bellowed the enraged reptilian man, as he swung his sword, intending to finally get rid of this irritating nuisance. He had been spreading seeds of false hope to his brothers and sisters for long enough, and he was done letting this charlatan deny his revolution. But his attempt at cutting down the voice hero was thwarted, as Shoji caught the blade mid-swing. The forearms that were touching the vast collection of swords and knives that had been put together were bleeding slightly where they touched, but the young tentacle hero was standing firm. A red glow surrounded the monstrous makeshift weapon, as Rocklock activated his quirk to hold it in place, while everyone in earshot covered their ears in preparation for what they knew was coming next. Suddenly, a shout pierced the air, being held for several long moments as the metal of the blade wobbled slightly, before fracturing into pieces, each of the individual knives and swords turning into small sharp fragments of metal. Present Mike shut his mouth, briefly massaged his throat in discomfort, before rushing in to help his allies. Spinner was furious that his sword had been destroyed so easily, just like a kimono. But, he thought to himself with a savage grin, at least I still have my own brute strength to fall back on. He raised his fists into the air and slammed them down, causing the ground beneath him to quake slightly from the force of the hit. Iguchi turned around, keeping the enemy in his sight as he tried to pulverize the heroes who dared go against him and his friends. Unfortunately, he wasn't really managing to hit any of them, as they managed to escape his strikes by the skin of their teeth every time. Irritated, he pulled out a large chunk of a nearby building, raising it over his head with both hands as he prepared to throw it at the flying hero above him, intending to take out their mobility and keep them stuck with him. However, as he raised it above himself, he could feel a sensation very similar to an itch all across his back. And with every passing second, it grew more and more painful. He gasped in pain as he felt a sudden stabbing pain in both of his wrists, and instinctively let go of what he was holding. Kota may not enjoy hurting people, but when it came down to it, he would choose to take down a villain causing trouble every time. His animal friends were able to force Spinner into dropping that heavy part of the building on top of himself on instinct. Hopefully, it would go a great way towards helping wear him down. The following second, however, he saw that his hopes were dashed. Mr. Midoriya's briefing and warned them about this quirk, and seeing the sudden eruption of scales across the gecko-esque villain confirmed his suspicions. Immediately, Shoji moved in to try and shatter the scales as they formed. His barrage of hits were unfortunately not doing as much damage as he had hoped, so instead the tentacle hero went for his ultimate move. Generating various body parts along his 8 arms, he created 2 massive arms as long as Spinner was tall and went to work. The villain gasped with each blow, as the air was forced out of his lungs by the sheer force of each punch. But as the onslaught continued, his conferred quirk went into overdrive, drenching him in blood as it generated more scales to compensate. Oboro saw this, and flew down to Hizashi, whispering out a plan. The blonde nodded, as a small portal opened, allowing his voice to travel through. He inhaled, drawing on every last lungful of air left in him as he prepared to launch the most devastating scream he had ever done. It was only because of a sense of imminent doom that Shoji got out of range in time, as a shriek far louder than Present Mix earlier yelled hit Spinner point blank, shattering his scales and doing some severe but not untreatable damage to the Enhanced League member. Shuichi Iguchi fell to his knees, rasping as he struggled to recover from his injuries. Shoji quickly gathered up several sections of rubble and strategically put them in place, with Rock Lock using lockdown on them to force them to stay in place, effectively keeping him from moving. Then, Rock Lock tapped his earpiece, listening carefully as he received a transmission from the hero's command center. Looking towards Spinner, he calmly revealed, "We were recording our fight against you and playing it to your followers. Apparently about half were too scared to defect before we caught them, and a lot of the rest really didn't like you destroying public property. Your army is almost entirely gone now, and your revolution is dead." Spinner's face remained unchanged. "I knew that their hearts weren't truly strong enough for true revolutionary work. Well, at the very least ᴘᴅᴟ will make things better for us, even if we lose. After all, people thought Destro's revolution was dead, until Daika City. Who's to say a new wave won't come in and achieve my goals?" Kota stepped up to him, looking steadily into the villain's eyes, as he spoke. "You really think we aren't working to change things?" He gestured to Shoji, as he continued, "Do you really think that just because we're fighting against you means we're fighting against equal treatment? Hell, we suffered just as much as you have. And we'll fight to make things better for all heteromorphs." Spinner said nothing for several moments, staring into the eyes of the 2 members of Class 2A, before he chuckled. "I tip my hat to the both of you, one revolutionary to another." Despite the man being a villain who had hurt so many people alongside Shigaraki, they couldn't help but feel honored by his generous words of acknowledgement. At the ruins of Jaco Hospital, 7 hero students from UA and 2 pro heroes were keeping watch over the giant beast of calamity known as Gigantomachia. In the chaos and confusion of the day of liberation, he had been left behind, as without the doctor or All for One present to wake him, he had slept like a rock. Tamura Shigaraki didn't have the time to wake him by more forceful means, what with heroes still hounding him and reinforcements on the way to apprehend him, so he had been forced to leave the giant behind. Mindjack, Red Riot, Pinky, Rule, Mudman, Grape Juice and Spectre were serving as the main defenders of the hospital, alongside Mount Lady herself. Of course, the size-shifting pro also had a secondary focus, keeping the giant pinned down if he woke up. At that point, her fellow pro could get to work on putting him back to sleep. Naturally, Midnight herself was tapped for that role, as her quirk was perfect for this. Minato had actually spent 2 hours so far helping his sensei collect canisters of her sleep-inducing mist, managing to keep his cool and act with relative normalcy. Afterwards, he had distributed these canisters throughout the hospital area, either for use against potential waves of enemies, or to ensure that ᴅᴇ'ʟ remained unconscious. Red Riot was one of the first to spot the oncoming horde of Liberation Front warriors. He would have engaged himself, but instead he held back, relying on his partner, Spectre. Surely enough, he saw his comrade from 2B levitating some lightweight weapons down and judiciously taking down some of the front line. He winced as she hit a man with a taser courtesy of Kaminari, who had made sure to give it to her before they had shipped out. That would certainly come in handy should anyone get too close. Soon enough, the enemy left the forest, heading in the direction of the hospital. Reiko touched her headset and relayed this fact to the others, who moved to meet them. The two of them could see MT Lady growing to her full size as she stood there, watching the oncoming horde, her posture almost challenging. In response, the armies of liberation charged forward, only to sink into the ground, as Mudman softened the ground to be like mud, before forcibly returning it to normal, effectively burying them up to their heads. It was then that Pinky struck. She darted around the battlefield, surrounded by a misty cloud of acid that melted away at the armor and support items of the enemy. Mina had discovered how to do this with Miss Midnight's help, allowing her to have a permanent aura of acid surrounding her, emanating from her pores just like somnambulist's mist. This passively wore away at all of the enemy's defense, with her liquid acid speeding the destruction along even more. Soon enough, they were left without many armored enemies. She got into trouble when it came to a certain sludgy villain. But Kugo and Midoriya had told them about this asshole, and her acid initially did very little to help her against him. But after striking several crucial blows, specifically on his eyes as Mito had told her, she was slowly able to rack up more and more damage. Soon enough, her acid became effective again, as the outer layer of his mucus was shed, leaving the more vital parts of his body unprotected. Within moments, she was able to gather up his melted body, scooping up the more vital chunks and sealing them in a jar, which she gave to Minato, who sealed it with one of his balls. Anyone who tried to free him would get stuck, preventing him from getting out once he reformed. Meanwhile, Kirishima and Shinso were busy fighting off villains at the base of Machia's cage. They were intent on protecting Midnight, who was busy producing her gas and channeling it through makeshift pipes directly into the giant villain's nostrils, keeping him from waking up. But given how powerful and energetic he was, it would take a constant flow of the stuff to make sure he had no chance of waking up during the battle. So the two warriors fought on, protecting their teacher and keeping the villains from interfering. There was one way that Mindjack could easily trick the villains, but doing it risked waking Machia. After all, if he thought he heard his master's voice, he would resist and push through somnambulist's effects and eventually wake up. The last thing that they needed was to have him up and about, so Shinso focused his efforts on hand-to-hand combat, something that Kendo had taught him the basics of. He had also sparred a few times with Ojiro, after an apology to the young martial artist for taking advantage of him during the sports festival. Mashireo had forgiven him and put him through his paces, correcting the few little issues with his technique that Kendo hadn't had the time to fix. And now he put those skills to use, as he took down criminals and malcontents with practiced precision. Every so often, he'd throw out a random question, putting his voice imitation lessons to good use. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. Some of the villains knew it was him trying to catch them off guard, and those were the ones to watch out for, because they were both smart enough to not fall for his ruses and aware of his quirk. Fortunately, he wasn't facing them alone. Rule was doing brilliantly, as together with Mount Lady, she was absolutely curb-stomping opponents. Turning their clothes into circus tents or small prisons was a special move of hers, which she used to incapacitate them. She covered her ears as she heard Mount Lady snap her fingers, before realizing what the Titanic heroine needed. Immediately, she pulled out a normal baseball bat and activated her quirk on it, enlarging it to match the large woman's current scale. With a smirk, MT Lady picked up the massive implement before smacking it on the ground right next to a gaggle of villains. Immediately, they fell to the ground, before being covered in sticky balls by grape juice. Yui smiled to herself, walking up to Grape Juice and asking for one of his balls. Minato blushed for a second before realizing what she meant. Then, his smile turned cruel as he handed it over, using his newfound ability to control their stickiness to prevent it from getting stuck to her hand. Within moments, it had enlarged to the size of Mao Lady's foot. Immediately, he started pulling more from his head, handing them to Yui, who threw them while activating her quirk on them. The entire fight took place over about roughly 10 minutes, and in that time not a single villain managed to wake ᴡᴇ'ʟ up or loosen his chains. Yet the heroes focused on their task, watchful for any other potential villains trying to free the monstrous villain. Satisfied that she had filled the monster's veins with enough sedative to keep him out for weeks, even with his stamina, Midnight stepped out for a second, marveling at her students' accomplishments. They truly were the future of heroics. Shota and Ken would be damn proud. On Okudo Island, the situation was developing quite nicely. Himiko Toga was having difficulties, as predicted. With ᴅᴇ and ᴅᴇ hounding her so consistently, she didn't have the time nor the space needed to recover and strategize. ᴅᴇ's senpai, Sirius, was learning quickly how to deal with the bloodthirsty Yandere, keeping her from doing any real damage while keeping her on the backpedal consistently enough. It would mostly be up to Selkie and Gang Orca to actually capture Toga's subordinates, with the 3 junior heroines having taken priority against Toga since the second years had experience with Toga. That decision had paid off brilliantly, as she was visibly on the ropes at this point, narrowly evading ᴅᴇ's fingers and ᴅᴇ's tongue. Himiko Toga fell to her knees, groaning. She was obviously exhausted, seeming to sway slightly. "Oka-chan," she began. "Do you really think that I'm a villain?" Ochako Uraraka pondered for a moment. If you would have asked her half a year ago, she would have certainly said yes without hesitation. But her answer had started to change once she learned about Deku, about Aoyama and Tenko Shimura. Her crush had been lucky to find an escape, as had Yuga through UA. But the young boy who had become Shigaraki had never escaped. She had always known deep down that hurt people went on to hurt other people, but had never fully processed that. "Himiko, I don't think you're a villain. Your quirk may be scary, and your worldview different from mine, but you're not evil. You're just different. But you're trying to stop me all the same, Oka-chan. You and Tsu-chan are treating me like a villain." ᴅᴇ answered, "We accept that the world hurt you, that they didn't care for you like they should have. But that doesn't mean that you should kill people. My quirk needs blood. I need blood. Otherwise, I turn into a depressive sack of shit. I just want to be myself." Ochako knelt down, though not quite close enough to Toga that she'd be caught off guard by a sudden slash with a concealed knife. "Yes, you need to drink blood to transform, even just to survive. There are people with quirks like that, but the problem isn't your quirk. It's how your parents reacted." Tsuyu continued her friend's thought, saying, "It was your parents' fault. They could have chosen to accept who you are and just make an arrangement with a blood bank. But instead, they made your cravings get worse and worse. And now they force you to hurt people. So what are you going to do to me, Tsu? Lock me in prison for the rest of my life? Not for life, just for a few years. You've killed people, and that's not something that we can let stand." "I have no intention of going to prison, Tsu," she said with venom, as something dropped out of her sleeve into her hand. ᴅᴇ rose to her feet, ready to fight. But surprisingly, it was not another knife, but a vial of shit. A tiny drop of blood. She had turned into Deku during the raid on the Hasaikai, but that had been before her awakening. They had hoped she wouldn't do this, but based on what they knew of Transform, she still had at least 45 minutes left to be Midoriya. Tan sludge fell off of Toga's form as her body transformed into the exact image of Izuku Midoriya, complete with the arcs of green energy across his lean form. Though her expressions made it clear that this was not the real Midoriya. For one, she looked far too happy being in his form. After a moment, Toga rushed forwards, hitting ᴅᴇ and causing her some sharp pain in the arm. The crazed killer smiled for a moment, before her expression turned confused as Oka-chan also smiled widely. "Tsu, she's only as powerful as the licensing exam. And she barely knows how to use it." Crap, they knew when she got the blood from. And by what they said, the two of them had trained to fight against Midoriya. She was screwed. Pulling her fist back, she called on the power she had felt from Midoriya back at the licensing exam, letting it all flow through her. Agony filled her senses as her left arm was shattered. She was forced to her knees from the pain, as she wondered why this had happened. "Isn't it obvious, Ribbit?" Sue asked from above her, as her head swam with pain. "You became as powerful as Midoriya was during the exam, but you don't have the knowledge of how to use it in the slightest. There's a reason we called him a bone breaker, and you just figured it out. It took him months to master his quirk enough to not break his limbs, time that you don't have. Come on, Sue, let's pick her up," Ochako said casually. Himiko groaned, trying vainly to fend off the heroes and channeling the raw tempestuous force of one for all into her right arm. Fortunately, the heroes were ready for that, and Toga passed out soon enough from the sheer pain she was experiencing. She maintained her form for the most part, though the left side of her face was noticeably back to its original appearance. Within a couple minutes, they met up with Gang Orca and Selkie, explaining everything that had happened during their rather brief bout with Toga. The two pros then relayed the information about Toga's failed trump card back to command, receiving an order from All Might to put Toga into a reinforced cell until they were sure that she had no access to Midoriya's quirk anymore. With that finished, the 5 heroes boarded Selkie's submarine and headed back towards the mainland. Within minutes of their departure, Monoma appeared, using Shirakumo's quirk to bring her to the new temporary holding facility that UA had constructed somewhere off the books. And as he left, there was no trace that Himiko Toga had ever been there. In the ruins of Daika City, Yoshindo, alias Grand, waited along with his sensei, Ms. Joke, as well as an important foreign hero. Together, the 3 of them would hopefully be enough to deal with the villain that had been worked here with them. Of course, if they weren't enough, there were others waiting on standby, ready to help them out. For example, some of the recent graduates of Ketsubutsu had come along to support Yo and his sensei. And while it was considered kind of overkill to have so many heroes here, including Star and Stripe, it wasn't in the long run. After all, their target was one of the League's most dangerous. ᴅᴜᴜᴜ stood there, arms outstretched. There were already several doubles behind him, doing wacky poses for some bizarre reason. "Your move, heroes," he spat venomously. He had never gotten over Hawk's betrayal of him, nor his imprisonment at UA. Twice looked forward to causing chaos for the League again. Grand rushed forward, and seeing this, the doubling villain raised his head and cackled, while the doubles rushed towards the heroes. Shindo was able to at least get his attack in first, placing his hands on the ground and releasing a powerful vibration that shook the destroyed city with violent force. He smiled as saw the masses of doubles fall to the ground, and approached the original, who was swaying slightly. But unfortunately, he was not quite fast enough, as Twice caught his punch with his hand, before sucker punching him in the face. With the horde back up, things weren't looking good. Fortunately, there was an easy solution. Rushing towards the original, Star and Stripe touched his chest and imposed a rule upon him. ᴅᴜᴜᴜ cannot use his quirk for the next hour, she commanded, with new order shuddering at the wording before ultimately bringing it into being. This opened up an opportunity for Ms. Joke to pull out the big guns. "What does a lawyer wear to court?" she asked the doubles as she punched them. Some of them looked quizzical, while most of them ignored her question, more focused on the fight. Then she dropped the punchline. "A lawsuit." Immediately, every single one of the doubles fell to the floor laughing. Shindo was able to walk around and manually channel powerful shocks into every one of them, breaking their arm and dissolving them into brown sludge. Finally, the last one left was the original, who had laughed himself into a coughing fit. With a hand on his shoulder, Kathleen Bate relaxed her rule about the doubles and said calmly, "ᴅᴜᴜᴜ will fall asleep for 2 hours." Immediately, Twice coughing stopped, and within moments, he could be heard snoring. Fukukato chimed into command, with Tsukachi telling her to make sure to secure Twice's hands. Soon, Monoma appeared, ready to transport the prisoner to the temporary holding facility by portal. Tuya Todoroki smiled as he leaned up against the head of the statue he was standing on. Really, building a fucking shrine to All Might at the site of his defeat? Pathetic. The number one had never noticed what had been happening in the house of the man he left in the dust. He could have saved them all if he was truly a hero at heart. But no, he chose to preserve the status quo of their society, when what was needed was for it to be burned down. Before, he had not truly believed in the ideology of the Liberation Front, more concerned with his revenge against his father. But all that had changed once Shigaraki had awakened, as his boss had managed to deduce his identity. Dabi had brought him in on the plan, and the symbol of fear had been ecstatic to help. It was as a result of that he met ᴘᴟ again, a member of his mother's family. Talking with his uncle helped convince him of the tenets of the Liberation Front, as ᴘᴟ based his rhetoric on Tuya's own circumstances. He had even lauded and praised him for his powerful quirk, which satisfied the small part of him that still sought approval. The two men, together with Skeptic, had set up all of this to inflict as much damage onto Japan as possible. And while they had been caught off their guard by the Aoyama kid's betrayal and the heroes somehow having access to another warping quirk, this would be the perfect opportunity for them to stop the hero's momentum in its tracks. He straightened up as he saw the flaming sidekicks heading his way, led by the perfect masterpiece himself, Shoto. Oh, how Tuya had dreamed of this day. Finally, he would be able to take out the little brat and throw his head at dear old dad's feet. Well. If it isn't Endeavor's perfect little prince in the flesh, he crooned, barely keeping himself from blurting out the truth. He wanted to savor the juicy reveal at least. And burn-in. Still kissing up to the boss, I see. Ah, this brings back so many memories. Dabi, his little brother growled, blissfully unaware of their blood ties. Well, he was about to reveal that little secret, and use the time to catch little Show off his guard. Hey now, don't be rude. You're acting like we've never met, he said with a foul grin that threatened to rip a few of his stitches as he pulled out a can of hair dye remover. The big moment had finally come, and soon all of Japan would know the truth. Across the square, Skeptic recognized this action as his cue and began broadcasting the pre-recorded message across not just the airwaves, but the entire Japanese internet. Every device would become a tool for the Paranormal Liberation Front, shaking their trust in heroes at the right moment to turn the tides. Next to him, ᴘᴟ smiled, knowing that his nephew would finally get justice against his father. Tuya felt the watery dye remover cascading down through his hair, and knew by the looks of confusion on the sidekicks' faces that it was working, revealing the snow-white hair that had been his natural shade since he turned 10. Call me Tuya, he continued easily, waiting for the expressions of dawning horror on their faces. After all, that's what Mom and Dad called me, little brother. But Shoto did not react as Dabi had foreseen. Rather than look shocked and horrified at the reveal, he was smiling. Hell, he was chuckling. What the fuck was wrong with this brat? Really, Tuya? You think we didn't know by now? He froze, as he was confronted by the terrifying realization that they knew. Years' worth of careful planning and countless lives ended at his hand, all in the name of finally taking his vengeance on the Todoroki patriarch and his favorite child. How could they wait a fucking second? Hawks, he rasped angrily, Shoto nodding in confirmation. How much did that little traitor actually do while he was with us? More than you'll know, brother. I'm taking you into custody. And where's dear old dad in all of this mess, huh? No way he'd chicken out on an operation this big, with an ego as large as his. He really did want to make sure that you were taken care of, but he had other responsibilities. After all for one is too powerful for even Hawks to take on alone. Don't worry, though. You'll be meeting him soon enough, his little brother said matter-of-factly. Tuya snarled, irritated that his years of hard work were down the drain. Well, at the very least he could still achieve his dreams of making Enji Todoroki suffer. He had perfect little Shoto right here in front of him. Concentrating his fire to its maximum, he watched as his skin charred under the power of his quirk. Everything was going as expected. Turbocharge, better known as ᴄᴟ, thought to himself. Dabi had definitely been caught off guard by the fact that his big dramatic reveal was completely ignored. And he seemed to be going even more off the deep end than was usual for him, as now he was letting the flames consume his body as much as possible in the vain hope of catching Todoroki. Fortunately, his classmate was one of Class 1's big three for a reason. Even without his ultimate moves like Phosphor and Heaven-Piercing Ice Wall, he was mobile and had a high damage output. Not mention that unlike his brother, his quirk had a perfect balance of resistances, meaning that he could endure a lot more punishment. Still, there was more up their sleeves that was yet to be pulled out. Ida himself had mostly been helping get the less mobile sidekicks out of imminent danger. The rest of his time was mostly spent fighting off Todoroki's uncle, who had also joined the fight. ᴘᴜ was a major threat in this fight, precisely because his mastery of ice had scaled to Dabi's skill with fire. True, he hadn't been able to win against him in a quirk fight, but he was a capable fighter. Not to mention that his ice quirk made any use of Shoto's ice risky. Of course, as Midoriya had proved at the sports festival, even a massive amount of ice could be broken through with enough power behind it. And Tenya took great ease in smashing every one of his constructs, even if they quickly reformed. Taking ᴘᴜ was one of the top priorities, as he was capable of potentially cooling Tuya down and compensating for the damage that Blue Flame had wrought. Besides, it would make dealing with Dabi himself much easier, as they could actually use ice against him, which was a hard counter to his flames. Shoto was having quite a lot of trouble dealing with his brother's flames, relying on a subtle use of phosphor beneath his uniform to keep himself regulated. If he had used ice, his uncle would have pierced his skin, and he was waiting to reveal phosphor properly once ᴘᴜ was out of the way. Though with his quirk, he was able to help burn in and turbocharge in dealing damage to ᴘᴜ's constructs. Eventually, 괘ᴜ got into the perfect position to use traject on ɪṛ, setting up the opportunity for the engine hero to land a devastating kick on the distracted ice villain. With that finished, ɪṛ picked up his new prisoner and made for the control room nearby where Skeptic was hiding. He easily managed to put the Liberation Front's tech guru into restraints, before halting the broadcast of Dabi's message. Everybody had already seen it by this point, but at least it would allow them to address the issue, along with the rest of the media circus that was certainly going to happen once this battle was done. Closing the laptop, he looked around the room, making sure to remove any potential method that the two villains could use to escape their restraints or use their quirks. Then he returned to the fight, signaling for the next group to join in and help take down Tuya. Dabi was frozen with shock at what he was seeing. Both of his other siblings, as well as his mother, were here now, standing side by side with Shoto. It infuriated him, causing the heat of his flames to reach a peak he had not yet achieved, burning off the rest of the flesh on his face and turning him into a blackened husk wreathed in blue flames. Hell, he was breathing fire at this point. In response, his family called upon their frosty quirks. Natsuo used his ice to form swords, while a blizzard surrounded Fuyumi. But it was his mother and littlest brother who were the most terrifying. Rei, who he had always seen as a helpless victim beaten down by his brutish father, looked him firmly in the eye and summoned forth icy dragon sculptures, almost identical to ᴘᴜ's own. But of course, there was a difference. His uncle's ice ply could not generate ice, only manipulate it. But Frost could create and control ice, making her much more of a threat to him than her distant cousin had been. And then there was Shoto, using his mastered version of phosphor to keep his family safe. His ability to control the temperature of his flames was something he used carefully, coating his loved ones in a fire that was barely warm. Just enough to keep them from freezing over from overuse of their quirks. Then the four of them, along with ɪṛ and the flaming sidekickers, went to work on Tuya. Anima was especially useful, interposing himself between the large blasts of fire with his flame resistance quirk, which combined with his years of working with other hot-headed fire wielders gave him a great amount of heat tolerance. He defended the Todoroki matriarch and her middle children from the fiery outbursts of her eldest, while Pyrofrost and Turbocharge focused their efforts on snuffing out Dabi's sparks. Honestly, ɪṛ was doing marvelously in this environment with 4 Todorokis there to cool his engines down and ᴘᴜ there to help get in hits on Dabi. He was performing at peak efficiency without even using his recipro. Meanwhile, Burnin focused her attention on distracting Dabi, knowing that there was little her flames could do to stop Tuya's own. After all, they were better than his father's and near Shoto's own. Suddenly, a purplish flame started flickering on Tuya's chest, almost like no. Hey, Shoto! Am I doing this right? How the fuck do you have an ice quirk? Natsuo shouted, as he created icicles and threw them through Traject's area of effect. I don't know. Tuya said frankly. Maybe because I'm going farther than ever before. Really could have used this back at Sakoto, but better late than never. The mention of the place where Tuya had thought to have died struck a chord with the Todorokis, as they decided to end this once and for all. There was only one way to end this for good. Channeling their full power over Cold as One, with Shoto's phosphor flames allowing them to go far further than ever before, they unleashed an onslaught of wintry fury. A heaven-piercing great glacial ague erupted, with Dabi at its very center. And no matter how much blue flame managed to melt, the continued wave of cold would easily manage to replace. Shoto's initial glacier of ice was quickly reinforced by crystal serpents made by his mother, with Natsuo and Fuyumi coating it in several inches of snow every second on every side, which quickly compressed into more ice. This went on for several minutes, with the sidekickers using their fireworks in order to help keep the Todoroki's ice coming. The sudden flare of Tuya's blue flames, in what looked suspiciously like Enji's own prominence burn over Fukuoka, destroyed the icy sculpture in one blast. For a moment, they feared that he was about to launch an attack, ready for the carnage that the number one sun would bring. But instead, out of complete exhaustion, Dabi fell to the ground. Everyone got close to the man, cautious of a potential trick. Yet it did seem that Tuya was running on empty, exhausted from the endurance fight and especially from the powerful blast of fire that had freed him. "Tuya," Fuyumi said, tears at the corner of her eyes. "It's really you. You've been alive all this time." "Of course I have," he rasped. "I had to become the strongest. That's what we're here for, why Dad made Mom into his little baby factory." "Tuya," Shoto said seriously, "Natsu was attacked by ending months ago. We know he was paid off by the Liberation Front." "Was that you?" "Yeah, it was," he confessed lazily. Natsuo's eyes widened, as Shoto screamed at his brother. "Why? You used to cry to him, Tuya. Why did you have to use him as part of your vendetta against Dad?" "Because it would hurt Dad. That's the only reason I did anything, ever since I woke up after Sakoto. I went home and saw that nothing fucking changed with my death. Dad trained no, beat his masterpiece, just the same as he had with me." "That's not true," Fuyumi argued, but Natsuo interrupted her. "Your death at Sakoto Peak was the last straw for me. That was what made me hate Dad the way I do. Because if he didn't see how desperate his first child was for his love, then that proved he wasn't a good father. And while I understand why he wanted you to stop, it was cruel of him to do that." Nothing was said for several long seconds, before Rei spoke softly to her firstborn. "Tuya, I have always loved you, and I have always wanted you to be happy. But this is too much for me. You've tried multiple times to kill your siblings just to get your father's attention. Honestly, sometimes I worry that you're worse than him." "Oh, really?" This coming from the bitch who burned her baby boy and then made it worse with her quirk. "I know Dad treated you like shit, but you don't get to fucking talk to me about how fucked up our family is." Dabi fell asleep in the middle of his rant, as Ida injected him with a concentrated form of Midnight's sedative solution. "We'll talk about this later, when we have the time to spare," Shoto said, as he lifted his unconscious brother, while Ida contacted headquarters. Soon enough, Monoma appeared through a warp gate, with a gurney behind him. He placed his brother on it, making sure to tie him to the edges, before the 1B student left with Tuya as well as the 2 other Liberation Front members. In the forests near the site of the once glorious Gunga villa that had served as the Paranormal Liberation Front's main base of operations, a large crowd of heroes was waiting anxiously, led by the number 1 and number 2 themselves, along with 2 members of the by now legendary Class 2A. Usually, it was against policy to send so many heroes against a single villain, let alone to send the top 2 to lead the charge. But their opponent was a unique case that forced them to pull out all the stops. Because floating lazily in the air like a hangman was the symbol of evil himself, all for one, attended by several doubled Nomu. Endeavor, the masked villain, intoned jovially, "So nice to see you again. Tell me, how does it feel to be in All Might's place? How does it feel to know that you will never reach his level?" Endeavor remained silent, before a wave of pings erupted on the heroes' phones as a broadcast began across all of Japan. Ah, that would be Dabi spilling some harsh truths to the nation. And what is harsher than family secrets, right, Enji? Enji Todoroki didn't respond to the villain's barb, instead snickering. Caught flat-footed, All for One wondered what the flame hero found so amused. "So you've already riddled it out. How unfortunate. I had hoped to stab at your heart for young Tuya's sake, but I shall have to make do with your agonized screams. We've been several steps ahead of the League for a while." "You can thank my right-hand man for that," Endeavor said, gesturing towards Hawks, who threw a mocking salute towards the ancient supervillain. "I must admit, he played his role quite admirably. Though he failed to do the most crucial thing in sparing Tamura's lieutenants an execution. Thanks to your misguided mercy, the League of Villains remains as a powerful threat against all that you hold dear. Come now, he beseeched his opponents, let us finally end these meaningless pleasantries and get to business. Agreed, the flame hero grunted, with every single one of the heroes tensing, steeling themselves for the oncoming battle. With a snap of his fingers, the Demon Lord set his bioengineered monstrosities upon the grounded heroes, intending to wipe them out so that they could not get in his way. And the screeching of the high-end Nomu signaled the start of the fight. Immediately, he was rushed by ᴬᴇ-ᴟᴏ, who, covered with dark shadow, was able to rip and tear into the flesh of the Demon Lord. True, he did little damage given that All for One had super regeneration, but it was enough to distract him from Hawks, who had circled back around the villain and started to tag team him with his winged protege. ᴬᴇ-ᴟᴏ's abyssal talons shredded into All for One's suit, while Hawk's feather blade slashed many times across his body. Soon though, the two heroes were forced to fall back, as the Demon Lord reached out towards them. Fortunately, Endeavor was there, ready to cover his fellow heroes' backs as they tactically retreated. The Flame Hero unleashed an onslaught of fire-infused punches and kicks, most of them aimed at the villain's life support mask. He was quickly able to break it, though All for One repaired it several times with a telekinetic quirk. Undaunted, he continued to press his advantage until he was noticed by one of the Nomu, who screeched and rushed to its master's side. Now unencumbered, All for One smiled as he saw one of the members of last year's freshman class. It was time for him to get rid of the side characters so that he could focus on the real heroes. ᴬᴇ-ᴟᴏ quickly noticed the villain charging his air cannon, aiming right for Jiro. He shouted, warning her of the danger, and in his distress, Dark Shadow rushed to her side. Kyoka was quickly enveloped by Dark Shadow, so when the projectiles hit, she wasn't hurt any more than a few minor bruises. Nodding at her shadowy friend, she mentally thanked Hatsum. This jetpack would come in useful. ᴬᴇ-ᴟᴏ quickly reunited with his other half, having been caught by Death Arms when he fell. The two of them quickly returned to the air, drawing All for One's attention and holding it with some difficulty. This allowed Jiro to get just barely close enough to be able to fire off a legato heartbeat surround, disorienting him enough that he was left open for a combo between the four heroes. After a minute of punching him, though, he recovered, and they instinctively jumped back, anticipating a counterattack. But for some reason, he could not. He was trying very hard to use his quirks, but for some reason, he couldn't. Hell, even his flight quirk was starting to fail, working only in fits and starts. And then, it stopped working entirely and he began to fall. Immediately, the Nomu stopped their rampage and flew to their Dark Master's aid, holding him gently and carefully like a king or a deity. As they reached the ground, they formed a protective circle around the Demon Lord, who was kneeling on the ground, with his hands on his helmet. "Everyone, take out the Nomu. Now's our chance," Hawks cried, as he rushed towards All for One. One of the Nomu turned to attack him, but was sucker punched in the back of the head by Death Arms before being stabbed in the brain by the winged hero's blade. It dissolved into brown sludge, like all other doubles. Earphone Jack was right behind the number 2 hero, using her jacks to send vibrations into the brains of the Nomu, taking out several of them through overwhelming amounts of brain damage. Soon enough, the Nomu were down, and Endeavor was posed to cave in the ancient villain's head while he was struggling with the vestiges of his stolen quirks. But a second wave of pings from the heroes' phones distracted them. Enji's heart began to beat quicker, as he saw that Shoto and the rest of his family had managed to take care of Tuya. Maybe they could be a family. His musings were interrupted by maniacal laughter, and he looked down at All for One, seeing him slowly beginning to rise to his feet. "Sending one son to take care of the other, Enji? You know that all Tuya ever wanted was your love and approval. And you ignored him, even sending your youngest to clean up your mess instead of facing your own mistakes," the villain drawled. "The reason you're here fighting me isn't because you have things to protect as a hero. It's just your sad way of avoiding responsibility for your actions." All for One began to float once more, though he could only rise about 5 feet off the ground for now. With quirks appearing at his fingertips, he delved deep into his well of stored power in order to sow chaos on the battlefield. Endeavor responded by erecting a Hell's Curtain, while Hawks prepared an attack. All for One was ready for such an obvious maneuver, creating a ward to protect him while he faced the number 1 hero. But he was caught off guard by the volley of feathers that flew through the wall of flame, piercing into his flesh before returning to their master. Before he could react, though, ᴅᴘᴛᴏ fired off another heartbeat surround through the fiery barrier, while ᴅᴘ added in a jet burn to turn up the heat of their combined attack. ⴡⴚ gasped in pain, as his skin was charred and seared. Fortunately, it was not quite enough to be of any use against his super regeneration. Within several seconds, his flesh was more or less back to normal. Yet he failed to notice a certain key fact: one of Hawk's feathers, launched early on in the battle and sent to the upper limits of the atmosphere, was now coming back down. It hit the top of his helmet and cracked it into several thousand pieces. ⴡ began breathing heavily and unevenly, gasping for breath. But soon enough, he recovered enough to be able to speak. This body was destined to fail anyway. Might as well perform this little experiment, here and now. As ⴡ rushed towards him, intending to stop whatever mad plan the villain had up his sleeves, the oldest of the Shigaraki brothers pulled out a syringe and injected himself with it. Immediately, he was bathed in a familiar aura of golden light. Rewind. With every second, the villain's long-marred flesh began to regenerate, his once handsome features returning, proving that the symbol of evil was just as much of a seductive tempter as the demons he claimed to be one of. You know, ⴡ, there is a reason I know so much about ᴘᴜ's fate. Haven't you guessed yet? The restored villain asked rhetorically. It was I who recovered ᴘᴜ's body. It was because of me that he survived to become the villain he was meant to be. ⴡ began trembling with barely restrained fury as ⴡ continued speaking. True, I had intended for him to possibly become the next me, but he had other plans. And I must say, I'm just delighted by what he's accomplished for me. Todoroki vibrated with an all-consuming fury as he was confronted by the reveal that the Emperor of Darkness had just made. He had done this. It was his fault that he hadn't been able to find ᴘᴜ and save him from this path. Every single one of his instincts as a hero and a father demanded he kill the villain now and take revenge on this man for all the pain and misery he'd inflicted. But instead of rushing at ⴡ and trying to choke the life out of him, ⴡ took a deep breath. He knew from the fight at Kamino, as well as All Might's account of their previous battles 6 years before, that this was the kind of thing that ⴡ did to trip people up. And though he was many things, foolish was not one of those things. He needed to take care of this villain here and now for his family, for Japan, for the world. Rather than setting aside his anger, though, he held onto it tightly, compressing it and letting it burn hotter than his own fire, driving him to make things right, even if he needed to sacrifice himself to do so. Hawks, Tsukuyomi, ⴡ, cover me, he said with tranquil fury. None of us alone will be enough. But together, we have a shot at finally taking down this monster. ⴡ's smile became slightly less genuine for a moment, as he seemed disappointed that ⴡ hadn't fallen for his bait. All Might had spoiled his fun, it seemed. No matter, he would kill them all regardless. Then he would take one for all and rule this world as its lord and master. Raising his hand, he fired a sudden blast of air directly at Jiro's chest, intending to kill her and prevent the vestiges from being riled up against him again. Fortunately, ⴡ responded almost instantly with a heartbeat wall, using her racing pulse to strengthen her barrier. Enraged at the attempt on his friend's life, Dark Shadow rushed towards ⴡ, who deflected the monstrous shadow beast's talons with a nonchalant wave of his hand. But surprisingly, the sentient Quirk pulled out a new move that none of them could have predicted. Dark Shadow split into two identical halves, with Tokoyami still floating in the air looking speechless. Hawks recovered quickly from his shock, rushing in with a barrage of flying feathers around him and slashing at the villain. With super regeneration and rewind working together, he could barely even tell that he was managing to hurt ⴡ. Fortunately, the ancient supervillain seemed more occupied with Dark Shadow right now, who was keeping him very distracted while Tokoyami was standing there, telepathically communicating with his other half and devising a plan. Suddenly, the two Dark Shadows transformed into shadowy chains, tethering ⴡ in place. ⴡ, you're up, he shouted, with Hawks quickly getting out of the way. Enji poured in every ounce of his being into his next punch as he rushed towards the man who had taken away his precious baby boy. Using his fire and his righteous fury together, he could feel the flesh on his hand beginning to melt as he compressed his quirk into his fist. Rushing across the battlefield, he uppercut ⴡ on the chin, hitting him so hard that Enji knew that anyone else would have died instantly. And true, he did do a hell of a lot of damage. The bottom half of the villain's face, and most of his throat was covered in third-degree burns. But of course, that damage certainly didn't last. Even though the cells in that area had been carbonized from the heat around his fist, the rest of ⴡⴜⴜ's body was unaffected. And besides, the damage was not so extensive that the effects of rewind weren't able to undo it. Slowly but surely, the wounds began to be undone, the flesh returning to health and covering up the few spots where Enji had managed to burn down to the bone. Seeing this, Endeavor immediately remembered one of the key facts about Eri and her rewind. Her first known use of it rewound her father out of existence. If they could keep him restrained and unable to attack, he'd eventually de-age himself to death. Looking towards the student trainees, he barked out his orders, the two of them nodding as they went about their tasks. ᴘᴇᴟ strengthened the chains on ⴡⴜ lengthening them and giving the ends to some of the heroes on the ground. Meanwhile, Jiro prepared for another heartbeat surround to stop him from using his quirks. Unfortunately, the Demon Lord was a crafty bastard. Lifting his arms in front of him as ⴡ blasted him, he conjured a barrier behind his arms. But more importantly, the sonic attack broke the chains that Dark Shadow had bound him with, leaving him free to move. He immediately rushed towards Hawks, intent on finally taking away the quirk of the hero who had been such a thorn in his side recently. And yet, for some reason, he stopped, seeming terrified at the sight of something in the distance. Following his gaze, the heroes were stunned to see, of all people, All Might himself, looking just as he had in his prime. "You, how can you be here?" he hissed in disbelief. The symbol of peace laughed boisterously, before making a taunting gesture towards ⴡ. He dropped his current prey and launched towards All Might, but stopped just short of him. From what they could tell, his flight quirk stopped working all of a sudden. The Demon Lord knelt powerless before his nemesis, staring hatefully up at him. All Might picked him up by the throat and smiled toothily. Unexpectedly, the visage of the former number one melted away to reveal a hooded figure with their face hidden in shadow. With a snap of their fingers, the two of them disappeared from sight, leaving not even a single trace. Naturally, Endeavor and the others immediately contacted All Might at headquarters, only to learn that he had been there since Aoyama had confronted ⴡ. They diligently passed on what they had seen, and prepared to move out towards UA, where Tamura Shigaraki was even now fighting against the best that they had. All Might frowned as he thought of what had happened at the Gunga Villa site. There were precious few individuals he could think of who had the kinds of quirks suitable for impersonation of him. And while Himiko Toga was the obvious answer for such things, she had been captured by young Azui and Uraraka already. Part of him wanted to think that it was her double, whom they had prevented from entering UA during the preparation stages, but Yagi wasn't truly sure. For one thing, Himiko didn't have the ability to turn people invisible, and for another, the double had been coated with nanobot trackers just like the real deal and the rest of the Liberation Front. Whoever had taken ⴡ didn't have them at all. They only knew where that person was heading thanks to the bots on the villain himself. Deep down, he thought about whether it might be his successor, finally showing his face after whatever had happened to him. But he didn't want to get his hopes up. After all, one of the things Hawks had noticed about the figure was that they had straight silvery hair, as opposed to Midoriya's green curls. Yagi sighed, took another swig of coffee and focused his attention on the last remaining battlefield of this war, the place where it had all started, UA High. As soon as Shigaraki was dealt with, the heroes could get back to making sure Japan was safe again. And then the real work would start, as he and Nizu wrestled with the Commission over policy. He did not look forward to fighting against the Hero Commission, knowing full well from Lady Nagant that it was protocol for them to have plans to take out any hero who spoke out against them. That meant that any day now, an assassin was certain to be gunning for him because of his work with Nizu and Put Your Hands Up radio. But even in retirement, All Might was still a hero at heart. So he did not fear the threat of assassination by a shady government, so long as the people he had sworn to protect were happy and safe. Hopefully soon, he would find young Midoriya again, and Japan would know a true and lasting peace. Tamura Shigaraki snarled in anger as he realized where he was. UA, of course. And there was a goddamn force field in place to keep him from flying off. But he realized with a cruel grimace that he wasn't trapped here with them, they were trapped in here with him. He could see several familiar faces around him: the Bakugo Kid, Best Jeanist, Mirko. 3 newly graduated heroes who had been giving his forces a hard time ever since they had finished at UA Lemillion, Sun Eater and Nijire-chan, or Boundless as she was calling herself now. But the one who he was most focused on was the man of the hour, the very same brat he and Sensei had been dealing with for just over a year, Izuku Midoriya. The Grand Commander smiled widely, his face contorting into a foul expression of sadistic pleasure as he beheld the bearer of One for All. Hopefully very soon, he would finally take that power for himself. After that, he would have no need for sensei anymore, and he could rule this world unopposed. ᴘᴅᴟ slowly knelt down, keeping his eyes on the heroes. He locked eyes with Midoriya as he touched the ground, intending to wipe them out with decay. But the earth under his hand, rather than spreading his quirk, instead flew upwards, disintegrating in midair. Within moments, the ground he had just touched was replaced, and he snarled. Decay's spreading abilities were out as an option, so he quickly got to his feet and rushed towards Best Jeanist. He had the potential to be very irritating, so he made sure to take him out first. Or at least, he tried to kill the hero. Bakugo and Midoriya intercepted him with speed comparable to his own, mangling his right hand and knocking him back by about 30 feet before falling back. Suddenly, Lemillion appeared in front of him and hit him right in the gut, knocking him back by another 20 feet. The heroes began to regroup, taking advantage of the slight opening they had created to build momentum. Sun Eater began wailing on him with tentacles bundled together to form massive fists, taking inspiration from one of his Kohais in Class 2A. But of course, that wasn't all that he was using from the octopus he had eaten. He was simultaneously using their camouflage ability to keep Shigaraki guessing. Bakugo pulled out a support item that Hatsum had made for him and began firing off rounds of liquid at Shigaraki, coating him in it. And Mirko was pulling off several impressive aerial combos on him. Unfortunately, Shigaraki recovered from the gut punch in time to catch one of Sun Eater's tentacles in his newly regenerated hand, decay spreading along its length. All three of the heroes that had been attacking leapt back, with Lemillion and Midoriya picking up their slack as they kept him occupied. Tamaki pulled out a knife, cutting off the affected tentacle and allowing the remaining part to regenerate, while the other half turned into dust. Bakugo, however, was simply grinning in sadistic anticipation. He drew on all the sweat across his body and rushed towards Shigaraki, leaving a volatile trail behind him. As soon as he touched the villain, ᴘᴅᴟ was immediately set on fire. The liquid that he had coated Shigaraki with was a highly concentrated form of his sweat. And since decay didn't work on liquids, there was no way for the symbol of fear to get it all off. He admired his handiwork as the villain's body began suffering major burns, and began adding to his masterpiece of destruction, inflicting additional damage all across the body of his foe. Soon though, he moved aside. Shigaraki thought that he was safe to heal up, until a powerful beam of energy impacted his chest. ᴄᴟᴟ fired off her most powerful blast, adding to the already damaged state of his body. But eventually, he managed to reflect it, batting it towards her tentacle comrade. Lemillion tried to go for a crotch shot, but he stopped short, noticing Shigaraki's hand very close nearby. So instead, he tried something a little more interesting. Using permeation, he pulled one of the villain's legs with him into the ground. Shigaraki was caught off his guard by suddenly losing his balance. He tried to pull it out of the ground but couldn't. It was completely impossible. With a sigh, he grit his teeth, reached down and decayed his leg. The pain throbbed in his head, but soon enough, it regenerated. Naturally, the heroes had quite a lot of problems with this, as Mirio's little stunt had actually managed to break the propulsion system for the bit of ground he had trapped Shigaraki in. The support course overseer had to launch all the nodes around it just to prevent the use of decay from destroying UA as a whole. But soon enough, they were able to replace the ground, preventing him from getting into the inner workings of their system and breaking himself out. In his distraction, Shigaraki failed to notice Tamaki setting up behind him. Sun Eater had been the one that ᴄᴟᴟ's blast had been redirected towards, and he had devoured it whole. With the powerful energy coursing through him, he began to call on everything he had consumed, forming the barrel of a cannon. Soon, ᴄᴟᴟ noticed what he was doing and put her hand over his mouth, force-feeding him more of her energy to charge up his constructed cannon. Eventually, he was ready to fire, even if it wasn't guaranteed to hit the villain. Fortunately, Best Jeanist noticed, and he was quickly able to bind the symbol of fear in place, forcing him to wear gloves under his impromptu straitjacket to prevent him from using decay to escape. Then he averted his eyes, seeing the bright flash of the cannon as the energy accumulated at the end of the barrel and hearing a high-pitched whistle as Tamaki prepared to fire. Agony racked ᴘᴅᴟ's frame as the beam struck him. His flesh melted away under the sheer power of the energy beam, with decay failing to protect him since it was plasma and not a solid. Out of the many quirks he possessed, only one worked to shield him from the blow, and that was super regeneration. Even still, it was barely effective, preventing it from destroying his bones and his brain. The light of the beam briefly outshone the sunlight, as if a new star was born in the Earth's atmosphere. And when it faded, a skeleton lay there. But the heroes knew better than to assume that he was dead for good. Sure enough, muscle and sinew began to appear, wrapping each of the symbol's bones and restoring his physical form with speed. Within seconds, he was looking more and more like the villain they knew, and in less than a minute, his body was fully restored, though he was still scarred from the initial impact of the beam. With a hateful look in his eyes, he glared at Sun Eater, firing a barrage of projectiles at him with air cannon. Tamaki retaliated with an onslaught of tentacles as he used his Kraken technique to prevent them from hitting him, with Nijire using her flood technique to keep the villain occupied. Dynamite also began using his Strafer Panzer support items to fire automatic shots towards Shigaraki, pinning him down and keeping his regeneration busy so that he wouldn't have time to recover. Midoriya gave the signal, and immediately they began to make progress as Eraserhead activated his quirk. He had been holding back from using Erasure until now at Bakugo's request, because the absolute lunatic had wanted to see how well he stacked up against him. Well, being able to turn him into a pile of bones even once was a damn impressive showing. But now it was time to get serious and start getting ready to either capture him if possible or kill him if necessary. With super regeneration and reflect no longer there to assist him, Shigaraki was limited to the enhancements that the doctor had given to his body. And unfortunately, those were not quite up to standard, as the powerful attacks of the heroes around him were slowly but surely starting to wear him down. Soon, Eraserhead got the signal that every one of the other teams, save for the Gunga Villa team, had managed to dispatch and capture their respective villains, and that they were headed in to assist them here at the floating coffin. Suddenly, the air seemed to chill as Shigaraki's body began to grow out of control, masses of fingers forming into additional limbs protruding from his hips and shoulders. Even as Aizawa tried desperately to erase whatever was causing this, he rose into the air, carried by 4 monstrous legs that held him up as he single-mindedly walked towards Midoriya, entranced by a desire to take one for all for himself at last. The flying coffin levitating over UA's campus now seemed to be more of a literal metaphor, and one more appropriate for them rather than Shigaraki. He had mutated somehow into an eldritch nightmare, attacking with fleshy tendrils while Aizawa stared at him. Monoma had even been taken off of prisoner escort duty to make sure that they had full erasure coverage. He was already dangerous like this without any access to his quirks. If he regained them for even a second, that second could spell disaster for them. Eraserhead sighed in relief as he saw the familiar sky blue of his old friend's portals. All of the other hero teams except for Endeavors had been ordered to head to UA to back them up, and they sorely needed it. Todoroki immediately went to work, freezing one of the legs that was holding Shigaraki aloft into place, using phosphor to superchill it before using his fire to superheat the air. The sudden clashing of extreme temperatures caused a pressure explosion, making the leg explode. Mineta was running frantically around him, covering the villain in balls. And while most of them were easily reflected, enough of them made contact to get the leg stuck into place. Of course, it was not just students who were fighting against Shigaraki. Namiri was desperately trying to put him to sleep, but he spontaneously mutated again, 2 pairs of hands forming into a face mask covering his mouth and nose. Hizashi was screaming at the top of his lungs at each of Shigaraki's legs in turn, turning them into a bloody pulp. But as each one of them was destroyed, they were easily replaced by 2 more. Uraraka was working with Bakugo and Kurashima, helping them get some height as they attacked Shigaraki from above. Unfortunately, they couldn't get a solid hit in with all of the tentacles everywhere. And Midoriya wasn't having much more luck, as though he was definitely putting in the work with One for All and binding the legs with Black Whip. His efforts only multiplied the number of limbs on Shigaraki's unholy abomination of a body. The class rep was having just as much trouble, his kicks dealing only minimal damage. Shigaraki seemed amused, if anything, by their attempts to attack him. He was floating there suspended by the multitude of limbs holding him up, looking down on them as they tried vainly to harm him. The only times he seemed irritated were when the attacks came close to his face, like when Aoyama fired a full power burst that nearly hit him in the eyes and blinded him. In response to that, Shigaraki covered his face with yet more hands, leaving his eyes just barely uncovered. He did need them to see with, after all, since his access to search was being blocked by Monoma and Aizawa. They kept trying to take down the behemoth monstrosity that Shigaraki had become, with little success. Even without his quirks, he was still a threat, but he remained contained by the force field. They would have tried to use Tamaki's makeshift plasma cannon again, except that it had nearly destroyed the force field last time, and a second shot definitely would. And they were not about to risk letting him free to wreak havoc across Japan. Unfortunately, there was no other backup left to help them take him down. Other than Endeavor's team, who was busy with All for One, all of the other heroes were busy patrolling and making sure that the Liberation Front's forces didn't try anything. They didn't seem to realize just yet that their leaders were doing battle with government forces, but sooner or later, they would realize something had happened and try and come to their aid. That was why the other heroes were needed to patrol. As for foreign heroes, they were all still busy mopping up the damage that the Liberation Front's allies abroad had wreaked during the Tartarus breakout. Even Star and Stripe, who had personally promised to come their aid should they need it, was still in America right now, since the villain Wolfram was leading a large group of prisoners and political dissidents against government forces. Hell, they were rumored to be plotting to kill the president. The situation necessitated that America's #1 hero stay stateside rather than tangle with Shigaraki. Still, they were getting along just fine. They had even heard from Endeavor that All for One had been taken into custody, though they hadn't managed to hear the rest of the conversation due to their focus on the fight in front of them. And that was when tragedy struck. By a sheer coincidence of timing, Monoma and Aizawa blinked at the exact same time, giving Shigaraki a brief window of time in which he could use his quirks. Midoriya, or rather the quirk clone of him, was in the air, sailing towards Shigaraki intending to use a smash on him. Shigaraki caught his punch, with decay activating immediately. The shouts of panic forced the two of them to open their eyes, but by then it was too late. Midoriya had turned into little more than ash and dust. Despite his failure to acquire One for All, Shigaraki looked triumphant, exulting in his victory. Still, the heroes fought on, trying desperately through their tears to take their revenge on the villain. They knew of course that hadn't been the real Midoriya, but it still broke their hearts to see what appeared to be his death at the hands of Shigaraki. All Might was panicking now. All for One's tracker signature was approaching UA, which meant it was entirely possible that he would be joining the fight. One bit of proof that would point towards that was the fact that their connection to UA's camera systems and the comms systems weren't working, a clear use of radio waves. Shigaraki's quirks were being erased, and that meant that it was someone else causing that interference. And as much as he wanted it to be the real Midoriya, he knew that it was almost certainly his old nemesis, who had likely killed his would-be abductor and headed towards UA. He barked out orders to the technicians, trying desperately to re-establish the connection with the heroes in the floating coffin, not noticing a certain familiar presence slowly beginning to fill his senses. "God damn it," Katsuki growled, coughing up blood after being hit by one of Shigaraki's massive limbs. "Uravity, you good?" "Just fine, Dynamite." "Stay frosty," she responded, nimbly evading the tentacles as they tried to wallop her. "Uravity, Genist's in a sticky situation. I'm a little preoccupied right now. Can you help him out?" Shoto asked over their communicators. "Copy that, Pyrofrost." "Genist will be on the move," ᴅᴜᴜ answered quickly, activating her jetpack as she headed towards Best Genist to help get him out of his current jam. "One for all," she heard Shigaraki rumble. "I can feel you. Where are you hiding?" She froze for a moment, noticing a pink aura around herself. Looking around at the others, she could see they were also covered in that aura. She knew this quirk La Brava's love. And other than La Brava herself, who was working with Gentle Criminal to keep the coffin in the air, there was only one man with that quirk. A figure appeared suddenly from a sky blue portal, with a familiar figure under his arm. He was holding All for One in his arms, though he looked far sicklier than when she had seen him last. When they used Operation Troy, he seemed livelier and stronger than he did now. In fact, he looked like he was near to death's door. "So, it seems I am not the only one to have reached the level of the singularity," the figure rasped in an entirely unknown voice. Though somehow, it felt off in some way, as if something about the voice rang false. "No matter. You shall fall, Tamura Shigaraki, just as young Akuma did." Shigaraki's eyes widened as he noticed the figure of All for One. He was obviously scared now, realizing that whoever this was, It wasn't someone he wanted to fight without access to his quirks. "Who are you?" he asked forcefully, his voice dripping with venom in the way that always made Ochako's skin crawl. "I am known by many names. To the people of Israel, I am Adonai in the name and YHWH. To the Chinese, I am Sun Wukong. To the Sumerians, I was Gilgamesh himself. I have been called the God Emperor of mankind, the creator of quirks and herald of the Meta Age. But you know me by a different name, Young Tenko. One that everyone here knows. For my true name," he lowered his hood, revealing an unfamiliar man with long straight silvery hair and pale skin. But slowly, that appearance began to change, shifting to look like someone they thought that they had lost. "Izuku Midoriya. You," Shigaraki hissed. "Didn't I just get done killing your ass? What the fuck are these bullshit cheat codes?" Midoriya smiled while the rest of them just gaped in silence at him. "What you saw was a clone created from one of the many quirks on our side, Tamura. And he has returned back to his source, back to me. His task was to wait here and protect UA while I waited for this day. And now that this day has finally come, his purpose was fulfilled." His face turned solemn as he calmly began, "I have always loved heroes, from the bottom of my heart. But all of you, my classmates, my friends, I love you even more. Because with you, I felt like I belonged. With you, I truly believed that I could really become something more than a useless Deku." A tear fell from his eye as he continued, "Japan is in its darkest hour. Will you stand and defend it? Our people, innocent people, are suffering at the hands of villains. Will you come and save them?" In the heart of every one of them, they knew the answer. And as an orange aura overlaid on top of the existing pink ones surrounding them, they roared in agreement, turning to face their enemy. Shigaraki's eyes widened, as he saw the heroes waiting to rush him, waiting only for Midoriya's word. "One for all, ᴅᴇʟʟ, love, insight and clones," he said, before breathing out clouds of green ectoplasm, which solidified into an army of warriors, led by 8 familiar figures crackling with energy. They too were surrounded by the separate auras of love and insight, amplified by the power of both quirks. Tamura cursed under his breath. Things had not looked good already, and now he was pretty thoroughly fucked. He was certain that he could see the face of his pro-hero grandmother looking resolutely towards him, and he snarled in her direction. The air chilled, as smoke covered Midoriya's face, and his voice changed, sounding as though he was perhaps possessed, with countless voices echoing his words. With a quiet and almost reverential tone, he whispered, "One for all, ᴅᴇʟʟ, rewind and erasure, 100%. Immediately, the energy of One for All surged across Midoriya's frame, bathing his body in its power and infusing his muscles with superhuman might. Through overhaul, his old scars and wounds quickly fell away, replaced by unblemished flesh. The dark energy of Black Whip coated his body, forming a suit of armor around him, protecting him from anything that might harm him. With erasure flowing across his body, he could ensure that Shigaraki had no chance of escape, and Rewind would ensure he could use 100% of his power without consequence. But more interesting was what happened to those who were being affected by love and insight. The energy of One for All was jumping to them and latching on, flowing into their veins and empowering them immensely. Bakugo looked as he had when he had held it before, with the orange energy flowing across his exposed muscles, though the explosions he was sparking in his palms were rainbow-colored now. Uraraka, by contrast, had pink lightning dancing along her costume, while her hair was floating as if underwater. The pads of her fingers were glowing now, as were her rosy cheeks. Ojiro was perhaps the most affected, as his tail had begun to transform rapidly, shifting into a demon's spaded tail, to that a monkey, to something more fit for an ankylosaurus. The energy coursing across his body seemed to stick to his extremities, forming glowing lines leading from his hands, feet and tail all the way to his heart. Interestingly, the energy flowing across his body looked very reddish-orange. By contrast, Best Jeanist, a seasoned pro who'd plumbed the depths of Fiber Master's limits, was not changed much. If he seemed to be affected by One for All's power at all, it was in the more obvious ways, specifically the dark blue static electricity that was jumping between the different parts of his denim outfit. Toru and Aoyama were resplendent now, the terminally invisible maiden's radiant beauty now revealed through the power of One for All, its energy taking the same kaleidoscopic colors of her hair. Yuga's energy was a dazzling silver, matching his flamboyant personality. His face was hardened as he faced one of the men who had forced him to betray his close friends, intent on getting his revenge and putting the ⴅ in prison where he belonged. Mayonetta was equally determined, staring into the face of the man he'd been so terrified of only a year prior. But his growth and the power that the purple energy afforded him kept him steady, allowing him to be courageous and face his fears like a true man. Midoriya closed his eyes for a second, raising his hand as he did so. Every one of the students from Class 1A, and all of the other heroes there fighting Tamura Shigaraki, coiled their muscles like a spring, ready for his wordless signal. And as he opened his suddenly red eyes, Shigaraki's quirks disappeared and Midoriya lowered his hand. Instantly, he was grabbed and held by the heroes, who forced him into a kneeling position, restraining him with the superior power of One for All. Only the vestiges of One for All held back, standing next to Midoriya and walking beside him as he slowly strolled towards the symbol of fear without a care in the world. He stopped before reaching him, allowing the 1st, 7th and 8th users to speak to the young man before he lost everything. "I'm so sorry that this all happened to you, Tenko. But know that none of this is my fault. It is because of All for One that this happened. Without him, I would not have had to give up my son, and he would not have become so cruel. Without him, you would not have acquired a quirk that was never yours to begin with, and our family would still be alive. Without him, you could have had a happy life. Don't talk down to me, bitch," he said hatefully to Nana. "My old master is a piece of shit, but we both know that society is fucked up, and the heroes are part the problem. So much of what happened to this society is because of my brother. I'm not saying he's the only cause, but he is behind so much of this devastation, even if only in part. The Hero Commission are corrupt, but many of their misdeeds were in response to his own. Did I ask the opinion of someone who idolized heroes? You're almost as bad as All Might, you asshat, always talking about peace and justice. Then why don't you talk to me, Shigaraki? You've always hated me, so tell me, what do you honestly believe is wrong with our society? I was searching for that for so very long. It wasn't until my fight with Destro that I understood what I wanted. Freedom. Pure and absolute freedom. True anarchy, where might makes right. I wanted a world where me and my friend could do as we please. It's a shame that it has to happen this way, Tamura," Midoriya said, stepping forward. Lining up, he sucker-punched Shigaraki in the gut, leaving him shuddering and gasping for breath. With his attention focused on recovering from the devastating and painful blow, he wouldn't have the mental bandwidth to resist what Izuku was going to do. As the black whip tendrils surrounding the fingers of his right hand unraveled themselves, he placed his 4 fingers and thumb on Tamura's hand, activating All for One. As Shigaraki recovered from the severe punch to his gut, he felt the vestiges of the quirks he had wielded gleefully leaving his control and taking shelter with Midoriya. He could feel his powerful and enhanced body weakening, as without the passive mutant quirks that empowered him, he was only about as strong as a quirkless high-end Nomu. The heroes let him drop to the ground as the power coursing through their veins slowly ebbed away. Izuku nodded to them each in turn. He desperately wanted to hug each and every single one of them, but there was still work to be done right now. After all, they were still in the middle of the paranormal liberation war. Soon enough, Monoma and Awaze appeared through a warp cloud, accompanied by All Might and Nizu. The 4 of them stopped dead upon seeing Midoriya, as they could somehow tell that this was not the clone, but the genuine article. After a beat, though, All Might and Nizu silently hugged their student, a hug which he heartily returned. Then he looked to the 2 members of 1B, holding out a hand in which 2 curly green hairs could be seen. Wordlessly, they took them, accepting the power that he freely offered them. Immediately, hundreds of doubles began to appear, before heading out through various warp gates to places across the world. With every one of the UA faction's major goals complete, there was nothing left for them to do but return to base for a well-deserved rest. Even as much as the teachers desperately wanted to debrief Midoriya and assess his claims, they were exhausted. After all, it had been several hours since Midoriya and Aoyama had left UA to start off Operation Troy. And they would need good sleep given the amount of shit they'd need to work out in the coming days, what with rebuilding Tartarus to be more secured and slowly restoring Japan's trust in heroes, as well as beginning to wage war against the Commission in earnest, transitioning from a Cold War to a very temperate one.